This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Visualizing Palestine, a chronicle of colonialism and the struggle for liberation, created by Visualizing Palestine. This striking collection of more than 200 full-color infographics is a vivid portrait of Israeli settler colonialism and the Palestinian struggle for freedom. As a new generation of movement builders seek to understand Israel's brutal, illegal occupation of Palestine, Visualizing Palestine's vivid and informative graphics reveal deep truths about the decades-long Palestinian struggle for freedom. As Noura Erakat puts it, Visualizing Palestine has captured nearly a century of Palestinian knowledge production in a series of striking visuals to further emphasize just how uncomplicated oppression is. The only controversy is whether this oppression should be accepted. Find Visualizing Palestine at haymarketbooks.org, where all hardcover books are 10% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the second of what I initially thought would be a two-part epilogue to our voluminous series, Thawra, an extensive investigation into 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdelrazak Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. But this is, in fact, it turns out, a three-part epilogue. I know you're absolutely shocked. Anyhow, this episode begins with the Oslo Accords as a watershed moment that rewrote the terms of popular Palestinian resistance. Negotiated from what Edward Said would call a state of supine abjectness, Oslo set a trap for the Palestinian national movement. It contained the struggle by disarticulating Palestinian institutional leadership from a grassroots base. It offshored the costs of internal policing and administration onto a now dependent Palestinian authority, all while legitimating a massive expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank. Bill Clinton, with bestriding confidence after his last rendezvous at the Palestinian Versailles, Bill Clinton joined Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at the Camp David summit in 2000, attempting to impose an entirely one-sided final settlement that aimed to fully liquidate the Palestinian cause. Yasser Arafat refused this demand for a final surrender, an event that's now, in American political and media circles, perversely cited as a sign of Palestinian intransigence. The fallout from Camp David helped spark the Second Intifada. In the fall of 2000, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank rose up in the streets, just as they had in the late 80s and early 90s. This happened after Ariel Sharon invaded the Holy Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, accompanied by hundreds of Israeli troops. The following day, protests erupted across occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Israeli military used lethal force against Palestinian demonstrators, firing more than 1.3 million bullets at them over the course of just a few days. Within a month, 141 Palestinians were massacred and almost 6,000 wounded. Even Palestinian citizens of Israel were not spared the violence. In October 2000, 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel were murdered by Israeli authorities. All of this was accompanied by anti-Palestinian riots. Thousands of Israeli Jews took to the streets, attacking Arab shops and homes in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Nazareth, and elsewhere. As Palestinian deaths and injuries continued to mount, the Intifada started to militarize. Popular mobilization was joined by a wave of armed confrontations with Israeli soldiers, and an unprecedented number of suicide operations were carried out by Hamas, Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, and Islamic Jihad. They were motivated by the belief that they would not only avenge the immeasurably higher Palestinian death toll, but also help achieve Palestinian independence by raising the cost on violent Israeli governments and the citizens that were electing them. But there was more to the Intifada than the tactics deployed within it. It was a moment in which the Palestinian people reactivated a sense of political engagement in the occupied territories across the Arab world and beyond. In the West, and especially among the ranks of the left, the structural terror of Israeli settler colonialism became clearer than ever. Israel's turn to apartheid, including by besieging Gaza and building the notorious apartheid wall across the West Bank, it all facilitated the rise of new global solidarity movements, many of which continue to function today. In the meantime, in September 2001, Al-Qaeda staged its massive attack on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. The attacks marked a horrific blowback from the U.S.-led campaign to support a global Salafist jihad against godless communism in Afghanistan, and also from the West and regional reactionaries' more general sponsorship of the most puritanical interpretations possible of Islam as a force intended to supplant the secular nationalist left. The chickens had come home to roost. The United States, of course, paid no mind, plunging headlong into a stupid, quixotic invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq. It was all part of a so-called war on terror that painted all Arab and Muslim resistance as illegitimate forms of terrorism perpetrated by an innately violent and backward, irrational people that had to be stamped out. The invasion and occupation of Iraq were a murderous disaster for the Iraqi people. The U.S. destroyed the Iraqi state, and it lethally sectarianized Iraqi politics and society. This deadly sectarianism then spread across the region, with fatal consequences still very much unfolding today. And yet, Arabs continued to struggle for a different future, and to be the authors of that future. In what became known as the Arab Spring, masses rebelled against authoritarian states imposed upon the region by constant Western imperialism. These authoritarian states, Thawra listeners know well, are the product of Western imperialism and of the defeat of popular movements. That's true whether those states declare themselves anti-imperialist like Assad's Syria, or were open Western clients like Mubarak's Egypt. People demonstrated against repression and against the neoliberal destruction of social protection systems. Protesters, first in Tunisia and then in Cairo and beyond, they demanded political and social freedoms, and they demanded economic justice. These revolutions, however, divided between an organized Muslim Brotherhood and looser youth and leftist formations. The movements dislodged some leaders, but they failed to secure new forms of durable power. The result was renewed authoritarian government and civil war, including in Syria. Assad's brutality and the intervention of regional and global powers turned a diverse revolution into a terrible multi-sided and sectarian conflict that fundamentally destroyed the country. The Syrian Civil War, alongside the U.S. invasion of Iraq, also led to the rise of the Islamic State, an apocalyptically reactionary movement that smashed through the imperialist borders separating Syria and Iraq. These two wrecked Arab giants were once hotbeds of secular anti-imperialist revolution, regional pace-setters for a progressive and egalitarian world. This second of our three codas to Thawra charts perhaps the dominant story of the contemporary Middle East, the wanton destruction of an Arab state system that was both the basis for sovereignty and local capitalist development, for authoritarian repression, as well as progressive power in the pursuit of the aspirations of the Arab masses. You will recall from our series that the states of the Arab East were once divided, broadly speaking, between anti-imperialist republicans and reactionary Western-aligned monarchies. The revolutionary ambitions of the Republican nationalists were crushed by the 1970s, even as the power of the reactionary monarchies grew stronger, a story we've told in great detail. What we've seen since the dawn of the new millennium, however, has been the wrecking of Iraq and Syria, technically Ba'athist, but actually ideologically deficient states where semi-state socialist anti-imperialism had long since degenerated into personalist, neoliberal authoritarianism, but whose independence from the Western camp still marked them for destruction. As giant countries like Iraq were destroyed, the entire state system began to collapse into a violent, sectarianized chaos. Ironically, of course, this very same Arab state system that the U.S. destroyed, it was initially created by Western colonial powers to divide and conquer the formerly Ottoman Arab East. Some Arab countries, though, became a threat once revolutionary movements took power. In fact, one could narrate back the entirety of Thawra from this vantage point. In the wake of World War I, the victorious British and French powers imposed a mandate system on the Ottoman Empire's former Arab lands. The British already wielded control of the Trucial states, which would later become the UAE, and of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman. They were also the power behind the throne in Egypt, which at that point included Sudan. Meanwhile, the British helped the House of Saud expand from the Nejd to seize the Hejaz, home to Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah, to seize it from King Hussein bin Ali, the Hashemite Sharif of Mecca, to whom they had promised a unified Arab kingdom, betraying him for a second time. Soon, the U.S. swooped in and developed ironclad relations with the new Saudi state, undercutting the British and taking a giant first step toward what would ultimately be near total U.S. domination of the region. The British shored up monarchies for King Hussein bin Ali's sons in Iraq and Transjordan. Palestine was, of course, declared the new home for a Zionist settler colonial project. If the British formula was hereditary rule and settlerism, the French took a different approach in Syria, first breaking Lebanon off from the larger territory and molding a Christian-dominated, deeply sectarianized government there. It was a sectarianism that would ultimately rebound back to Syria, too, an independent republic plagued by a series of constant military coups, a series first set off by the United States in 1949. So to recap, after the State of Israel was established in 1948, the region was controlled by Western-backed regimes, monarchies, and a settler colony. Of course, over time, a number of these states were taken over by Arab radicals seeking true independence and an end to imperialist power, including an end to the Zionist settler colony. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, North and South Yemen, they all at various times were governed by various radical forces. Meanwhile, so many different revolutionary currents posed major threats in those countries that remained under Western-aligned monarchies. All of those one-time revolutionary countries, save for Egypt, have been consumed by civil war. Egypt is today subject to perpetual economic dysfunction, sectarian violence, and a class war against the poor under the most authoritarian government in its history. Western imperialism imposed the Arab state system, then defeated the revolutions that seized power in many of those states, and, finally, destroyed the Arab state system entirely. And yet, hope still remains, even in these genocidal times, as we shall see in our third and final epilogue. For today, here's Abed with part 2. Briefly, before we get started, if you've made it this far in Thawra, you know how important this work is to us, and you know how much work we put in to this work. We can only do this and make this political education project free to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay, because we just want everyone possible to listen. We can only do that because those of you who can afford to support us do so at patreon.com/thedig. Every contributor gets our newsletter. Depending on how much you contribute and where you live, we also have books, tote bags, coffee mugs to send you in the mail. But the real reason you should contribute is just because that's what makes this possible. We paywall nothing. Please contribute now if you can. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Abdelrazak Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. We finished part one of the epilogue discussing the Oslo Accords and, relatedly, the rise of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which filled a giant vacuum created by the PLO's renunciation of armed struggle. Let's start this second and final installment of our epilogue by picking up there. How did the Oslo Accords play out through the rest of the 1990s and the years leading up to the Second Intifada, which began in 2000? And what did the Second Intifada, these years of enormous militant mass uprising, what did that movement expose about the reality of the Zionist project and indigenous resistance to that project in post-Oslo Palestine?
Let's start by remembering that the context of Oslo was one in which we saw the United States achieving paramountcy across the Arab region and across the Middle East, achieving also a situation of global dominance resulting from the fall of the Soviet Union, from the Gulf War, which set out a new phase in establishing a new world order. It resulted from the big changes of the early 90s, which were also accompanied by a Clinton administration that had taken a far more committed line to Zionism than even the Republican administrations preceding it. So this is a very important aspect of the equation to highlight, because as I've mentioned over and over, Americanization in the Middle East equals Israelization. The more you have the American empire establishing itself, the more it demands of people that they adjust to the existence of this settler colonial state. Which is why, by the way, I always say people get it wrong when they think that it's about Israel comes first, it promotes the interests of the United States, and then the US comes in. No, the US actually built all these bases, took over the whole region, and then started imposing this project throughout the 80s and 90s on the states that were under its patronage. And this process continues to this very day. So this atmosphere was the atmosphere in which Oslo was signed. It was a very difficult environment for the Palestinian people. You see here Clinton coming in, and what he does is he removes restrictions on settlements, essentially, while paying lip service and claiming to engage in a peace process. And now we have him and Hillary Clinton spewing lies about how they gave the Palestinians the greatest deal ever, and Yasser Arafat rejected it. I'm like, what happened throughout the Clinton years was the biggest expansion in Israeli settlements ever. And to be clear, settlements is a misnomer. These are colonies. Okay, so it's settler colonialism expanding into the West Bank. If we're going to look at this history in the same way that Zionism initially in the late 19th century and early 20th century began to establish colonies in the coastal areas and elsewhere, now it's spreading into the West Bank, which is the Central Hill Plateau. And that was happening under Clinton. Bush, for all his ills, senior, had frozen American loan guarantees to try to push the Israelis into some peace process. Clinton did not threaten to use any of these tools. And for our U.S. listeners, you will not be shocked to learn that one of the indirect ways in which your tax money and my tax money and everybody's tax money in this country is going to support Israel is through loan guarantees. It means that should the Israelis default on their loans, the US, you and I will pay for it. Okay, and that's why they get very low interest rates when they borrow, which is a great indirect service to this settler colonial state, one of many provided by the United States. So you have this expansion happening under Clinton of settlements, which means that the stated objective of Oslo, of establishing a Palestinian state, which was understood by Palestinians that went into this with good faith as a state on the 1967 territories and pretty much on these borders, which is the way it would have been if you were to apply international law. You would have just said, follow these borders. I mean, by the way, international law is flawed. It's still giving the Palestinians a raw deal on this matter.
22% of historic Palestine.
22% of historic Palestine. By the way, half of the territory that's given to the Palestinians in even the partition plan, which was already unjust. Okay, so the UN partition plan, if we were to follow it and apply international law as pursued in Resolution 181, then what we would have is a territory that includes large parts of what is now called the State of Israel. So this situation of denying Palestinians control even over that small territory is accompanied by a regime of total apartheid that starts to get hold in the West Bank. What they do is they divide it into three areas A, B, and C. In areas A, there's some level of Palestinian self-government. Theoretically, it's supposed to be Palestinian governed. Those are areas with a higher urban population density. But those only constitute a small portion of the West Bank. Then you have Area B, which is supposed to be mixed Israeli and Palestinian control. And then you have Area C, which is pretty much controlled by the Israeli state. And by the way, even the Israeli state doesn't even respect these boundaries all the time. In the meantime, there's big issues that are left to the final status, so-called final status negotiations phase. And these are actually the issues that matter the most, which is why this whole process was so ridiculous. Okay, so the question of Jerusalem, instead of saying let's apply international law to it, they're like, oh no, let's let them negotiate. How do you put two parties, one with a great army and a nuclear power and supported by the US and all these, the dishonest broker in this period, it claimed to be an honest broker. Well, it's a state committed to the state of Israel. How can it be honest? Anyways, they come in, they ask Palestinians to forget about Jerusalem. Oh, you can negotiate about it, but we don't know what's going to happen. Refugees, that's the heart of our people. That's the largest bulk of our people. My earliest activism, Daniel, like many Palestinians of my generation, we're all sons of and daughters of the shatat, of the dispersal of our people. We're all refugees. A lot of us are. We mobilized at the time in the right of return movement. There's very young people. I was still a high schooler when I started on that, precisely because of the feeling that was under threat in this period. You're going to have people coming and telling us, well, you're not allowed to go back home. You're an exception to international law. All of this was happening in this period, and there were attacks on Palestinians happening regularly, including the Ibrahimi Haram massacre in Khalil, what's known in English as the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre, where Baruch Goldstein, an American citizen from Brooklyn, who was active in the Jewish Defense League and who was a terrorist, went and at dawn shot at people praying peacefully in the mosque. So that produces the environment where Palestinians are looking there saying, okay, we stopped the first Intifada. We accepted an agreement that wasn't that great, this Oslo agreement, an interim agreement. We've made enormous concessions, and in the meantime, they don't even want to give us the scraps. They don't want to even give us the territories of 1967. And the settlements are expanding, everything, the land grab is expanding, the discrimination is continuing, the attacks are continuing. What are we supposed to do in this situation? That's, by the way, the background to the beginnings of Hamas attacks in this period in the 1990s, because they are saying, look, the official Palestinian leadership and the PLO in general has accepted a deal that's not good for the Palestinian people. They're going ahead with a process that is not bringing in any of our demands, basic rights, and they do not fulfill our aspirations. These deals are acting as a cover for the Israeli land grab, and we must do something about them. So they start working really hard on basically countering the Oslo path and on responding to Israeli aggressions through violent means, essentially, through the means of what they saw as the only way forward, which is suicide operations. We start seeing them. Now, the reason why it's important to talk about them is that it's almost always portrayed this period in light of some kind of Palestinian commitment to violence that is irrational and that is based on hatred. That is not the case. It is an occupied people. One section of it, the traditional leadership in it, which is a secular leadership, accepted a terrible deal, but it wasn't even getting that deal delivered. And in the meantime, another section, which was an emerging Islamic section led by Hamas and to a lesser extent Islamic Jihad, was now looking to do two things. One, expand its popular base by presenting itself as now the only resistance left. Since Fatah and the other parties that had been traditionally engaged in armed struggle, but that were part of the PLO structure, had gone along with Oslo and had established this new structure called the Palestinian Authority, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were registering that A, they don't accept this pathway, but B, that they will offer an alternative path to achieving Palestinian freedom and independence and self-determination. So they start engaging in these operations in response to the Israeli army violence, in response to the attacks on Palestinians and all these structural realities that we've just described. And that leads to a major internal problem on the Palestinian front. The Israelis were looking for a way to present the whole process as one that should be geared towards security. And this continues to be the main issue that's talked about now, to the exclusion of any discussion of Palestinian security, of course. And they started using these operations as their excuse, saying, well, we're fighting terror here. And of course, it stopped becoming about the land grab. It stopped becoming about everything they were doing structurally to control the people. You could have easily ended the whole situation by giving independence to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which would have been, again, the greatest deal given to any settled colonial state in history. They did not want to do it.
These days, we hear from Hillary Clinton and so many others in the establishment that the Palestinians rejected this huge opportunity at the 2000 Camp David summit presided over by Bill Clinton. It's part of this discourse, which we've referenced before, that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. What do we need to understand, not only about what happened at Camp David in 2000, but about how all of the politics and discourse surrounding it are invoked to mystify and obscure what was actually happening with the Zionist project and profound American complicity in it, exiting the 90s into the 2000s amidst the Second Intifada?
So, Daniel, what they do is they essentially come at the end of this Oslo process, which was flawed to begin with. And they come and say, okay, we're going to have a final status agreement. And of course, by then, the Israeli main character that had led the earlier Oslo process, Yitzhak Rabin, had been assassinated by even more extreme Zionists than him. I mean, he was always an extreme Zionist, but there are always more, he was not a man of peace, as is promoted. Is a militaristic Israeli army general, total colonial character. But he gets assassinated because there are always worse people out there. Now, under him and under his successors, Shimon Peres expands settlements. Netanyahu, of course, talks big and goes very aggressive on this stuff. And then Ehud Barak continues on this pathway. In the meantime, Clinton is watching and supporting and providing all the support possible. But then he comes to the Palestinian leadership and he's like, now you have to have a final status agreement. I'm going to bring you over and you're going to do something like Camp David, and we're going to end this whole thing, and I'm going to come out as a glorious imperial proconsul that has achieved everything that I want. Now, the problem is he's trying to do it at the expense of the Palestinian people on at least three fronts. One is the question of sovereignty. The Palestinian state that they were promising did not have full sovereignty. Not only was it going to be fully disarmed, not only was it going to be compromised on every security level possible, it was going to be a state premised on spying on its citizens, controlling them. It's going to be a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation on every front possible. But in addition to that, it was not going to have meaningful control over its borders or its airspace or any of these matters. Secondly, it was going to be a state that was going to lose a lot of territory, especially in key areas that have aquifers, key areas that have natural resources, but also areas that have been eaten up by the settlements and that had expanded so massively over the past while. And they were saying, oh, we'll do like land exchanges. So the idea was to give Palestinians inferior land with no possibilities in it, where they actually, their villages are not there, and so on and so forth. The whole thing was a sham. And in addition to that, and more importantly, drop core Palestinian rights. Drop the right to return. That was not going to be addressed. Drop the right to East Jerusalem and the holy places in it. That was going to be under Israeli control, and there was going to be some fake semblance of some Palestinian involvement. But given the fact that the Israeli government is committed to Judaizing the holy places in Jerusalem, especially the Haram al-Sharif Mosque, and changing the historic status quo there, they were opening this file over and over again. This is like outrageous on so many levels. But, we haven't had a time to talk about this from even a theological Jewish perspective, let alone a Muslim one. But the whole thing was based just on a Zionist land grab, not even any serious theological grounds. So they come in and they start demanding that Palestinians accept all of that. And Yasser Arafat was a pragmatic man. We've talked a lot about him here. Had he been given a semi-decent deal, and nothing would have been decent in this stage. Remember, all of it would have been premised on huge Palestinian concessions to a settler colonial entity that usurped their land. But he would have taken it. He could not come back home and tell people and face his people and go down in history as the person that surrendered all Palestinian rights and came out with something that is little more than a municipality and a lot less than a state. So he did refuse to sign. And then they went out there on a campaign to bash him and attack him and undermine his reputation. Calling him a liar. Clinton called him a liar. They engaged in a huge lying campaign, saying Ehud Barak gave a great deal. They still repeat this to this very day on every international arena, Daniel. It is outrageous that we have this situation going on. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in. Now, the subsequent course of action that Arafat takes once this happens is he tries to enhance the Palestinian capacity of resistance, and he tries to work towards launching an armed revolution in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But he gets caught. He tries to smuggle in some weapons. They get caught. He had always had a two-pronged approach. He was into combining the negotiation track on the one hand, but keeping the resistance option open on the other hand, which is the main distinguishing feature between Arafat and Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen is like no resistance whatsoever. Okay, you don't even have that option there, which means all what you're doing is begging the US, please, 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 please give us a state. Please give us semi-state. Please give us a half state, anything. Whereas Arafat was saying you have to keep that option open because you have to have at some point some mechanism for forcing through this project. So he works essentially plays a big role in the launch of the Second Intifada. By the way, amongst the grassroots, there had always been a willingness for resistance with his own party, Fatah. A lot of them were feeling the pressure that came from Hamas posing itself as the leader of the resistance in this period, and they were looking forward to, having a different era in which they could potentially launch a serious independence war of sorts. Which is why this Intifada, the Second Intifada, was called the Intifada of Independence. Now, as usual with all intifadas, it starts spontaneously, but in response to a major Israeli aggression that was calculated and designed to lead the situation to explode, which was the invasion by Ariel Sharon of the Haram al-Sharif alongside 1,000 security people and settlers and crazy religious fanatics that came in, entering this holy site and basically started desecrating it. This actually provoked a major clash in Jerusalem, and the Israeli forces started killing people on a large scale there, and that led then to an explosion of the Second Intifada as a byproduct of all the structural factors that we've discussed in the lead up to the 2000s.
Let's get into the September 11th attacks, which were almost immediately followed by the U.S.-led NATO invasion of Afghanistan, and then, ultimately, in 2003, by the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. American-led wars that we'll discuss at greater length in a minute. But I want to start out with the actual al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon and their broader context. The attacks obviously had enormous immediate significance for politics in the United States, across the Arab and Muslim worlds, and really everywhere globally. What does the arrival of al-Qaeda as this potent armed force that's able to wage this massive strike at the centers of American military and economic power, what does that tell us about the arc of Arab and Muslim politics over the long 20th century? Is it fair to see the 9/11 attacks, which were carried out overwhelmingly by citizens of Saudi Arabia, as the culmination of a deep tectonic shift of this longer process of reactionary Islamic politics supplanting left-wing and nationalist anti-imperialist politics across the Arab East and elsewhere, but especially across the Arab East, a shift that we've discussed and that was facilitated in so many ways by the West and by reactionary allies across the region?
This is a very good question, and it comes naturally out of discussing the Second Intifada, because the September 11th attacks happened during the second year of that Intifada. The Intifada had already been going on for a year. The Israeli violence and repression was huge. The amount of Palestinian mobilization was also huge. And then you get this 9/11 situation, which was a huge event in modern history, and of course we cannot overstate its importance and significance. For listeners of Thawra, we would have already indicated that all of this process had been in the making over the preceding decades. Afghanistan, in particular, played a big role in this. Fighting against the Soviet Union there meant that you had the U.S. encouraging recruitment of people from across the Islamic world under the banner of launching a global jihad against the Soviet Union and godless communism. Then started arming and training these people. And all of these neocons, this is the irony of this whole thing. The same people that declared themselves as fighting the war on terror were the same people that had armed this global jihad against the Soviet Union. And it's the neocon crew, it's the Rumsfelds, it's the people that were in the Reagan administration before and then were recycled into the W administration. What we were seeing was these groups come back after Afghanistan, after the Soviet Union withdraws. They're involved in the series of civil wars that took place within Afghanistan for a while. And then they come in and they witness the Gulf War taking place. And they're also witnessing events relating to Palestine, like the Intifada, the first Intifada, and later on, of course, the Oslo process and so on. Overall, regional trends, which they're viewing from their Islamic religious lens, the politicized one, as essentially a Western crusade against the Islamic world. They take a look at the map and they'll tell you, look, the US now has built bases in every Muslim country in the Middle East almost. It has essentially taken over. Right after the Gulf War, the expansion was huge. And they were outraged that this included the Holy Land, Saudi Arabia. You know, the Hijaz is in Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina, the holy cities. How can you have American bases in a country that has all the holy sites? They were outraged at the fact that the expansion of Western powers was taking place at a huge pace. And then at the same time, they were looking at places like Palestine and saying Muslims are getting massacred by the settler colonies established by these powers. So you have this wave taking place. Then you have other waves that seem to confirm this of jihad in the 90s. You have Chechnya and what's going on there. So the view was that there is jihad against the Russian aggressive forces that are denying the Muslim people of Chechnya their independence. There is jihad in Bosnia. They were saying, look, Muslims are getting massacred in Bosnia. We need to go and support them against Serbian nationalists and others. So it's a worldview that is based on a theory and a history and a practice. You have these essentially Christian Western forces attacking Islamic lands, attacking Muslims, massacring them, killing them, and expanding in their territories. So these groups now, having finished the job in relation to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan now, they start redirecting their energies towards the US role in the region. And they look at the US relationship with their government that they had initially believed was committed to jihad and so on, Saudi Arabia. But then they have a profound disgruntlement with that government. And that of course, this disillusionment happens over a long period of time, but it produces a reaction, seeing it as just a puppet of the US, as a tool of it. And this feeling is confirmed even further when the Saudi government starts cracking down on major Salafist preachers and thinkers that were promoting this way of thinking. People like Safar al-Hawali and others. They put them under house arrest. So this then leads them to believe that they need to be on the offensive. They need to go and fight the US in its own territory. It was expanding in the Muslim world. It was killing Muslims. Now it was time for payback. And they referred to 9/11. And of course, it was a huge massacre committed against civilians. But they were referring to it as a ghazwa, as a raid. They saw it as, why should the US get away with everything it does across the world and it doesn't feel the pain at home? We're going to make it feel that. So this was basically the underpinnings of it. That's the irony and the weirdness about it all. The American policy in the 80s paved the way for 9/11 in the beginning of the new millennium.
How did the attacks of September 11th and then U.S. President George W. Bush launching a so-called war on terror against Muslim and Arab countries and forces the world over, how did that all remake the terrain of struggle across the Arab East, and particularly for the Palestinian national movement? Dominant Western discourse had long framed the Palestinian struggle, and also more generally Arab anti-imperialist politics, framed it all as fundamentally a matter of terrorism. What did it mean then for 9/11 and then the never-ending war on terror to so powerfully intensify that framing in the way that it did?
Well, I mean, the framing, let's start with the framing. The framing was led by Orientalist figures that were close to the neocons, like Bernard Lewis, who was, by the way, his main issue, he was actually quite a single issue guy. His main issue was Israel. He was an extreme Zionist. He spent his whole career justifying Israel, promoting it, but he became very close to the neocon establishment. And he wrote a book at the time called What Went Wrong, supposedly about Islam going wrong. You suddenly have this explosion of studies of Islam, promoting lines concerning the clash of civilization. Of course, this had been in the making for decades, since the Iranian Revolution, really. But now it like went out of proportion. You had this explosion of a focus on Islam being the enemy. What is interesting about this, Daniel, from a global history perspective, is that we see now in this period essentially a political coalition that was built on evangelical extremist Christians taking power in the US. That's essentially what the W. Bush administration was, taking power over the Republican Party as well. I mean, this is the moment, and you know way more about this than I would ever do, but this is the moment when also the Republicans are going really hard in that direction. And they're coming in and waging a war against what they see as Muslim religious extremists.
They're waging a crusade against jihad.
Exactly. By the way, I love that characterization. I think you need to write an article or maybe a book even, Daniel, call it Crusade Against Jihad. That's brilliant. Others, like Tariq Ali at the time, were calling it Clash of Extremism.
Clash of Fundamentalisms.
Clash of Fundamentalisms, yes. But Crusade Against Jihad is better. I like it more. Anyways, and of course, like, intellectually and politically, this had been in making for a long time. I mean, already we had these Clash of Civilizations discourse with Samuel Huntington, other from the 90s. You have all these people that were promoting this discourse. There was this entire discussion, though, that was tied to this idea of failed Arab states. And this had been promoted, again, by a bunch of crowds in Washington around that time. You had the Israel crowd talking a lot about Syria and Iraq being failed states that need the major American intervention. You had the neocon crowd that was picking up on that language, speaking in the same way. You had all these different crowds that were promoting this line. And really, we start seeing a certain direction in US imperial politics that was calling for a far more aggressive stance in the Middle East, expanding what had taken place during the Clinton years. And really, by the way, I consider that the war on terror started with Clinton before even 9/11 started. He was already doing it in relation to Sudan, making all sorts of claims about Islamic groups everywhere, including in Palestine and elsewhere. So in many ways, there are continuities. It's just 9/11 makes it explode beyond recognition. And the fact that they go and decide to attack Afghanistan. There was clearly no strategic objective when it comes to attacking a place like that from the perspective of defeating so-called Islamic fundamentalism. They knew that this is not really gonna produce that. They still did it anyways. There are many different interpretations for why they did it. We don't have the time or space to go into them, but it definitely did fuel a military-industrial complex in a big way. It definitely created this sense of never-ending wars in a big way. It definitely consolidated a U.S. militarism, and it created a new identity for a certain brand of U.S. politics, premised on a sort of rejuvenated sense of imperial expansion after what was seen as a time of retreat since Vietnam. This was the new US that's not afraid of going and fighting big and huge wars outside. Now, of course, this was shortly followed by an attack on Iraq, which was even far more outrageous. It was based completely on lies. This was a period, of course, once you started to launch the war on terror and you did the invasion of Afghanistan. This coincided, of course, for reconceptualization of the way of framing the entirety of politics in relation to the Middle East, but also internally within the United States in relation to Arab and Muslim communities within the United States. So we see here the rise of war and terror discourse. Islam is associated with terror. And as I mentioned, already you have that under Clinton before, you already have precedents with that, but like now it expands on a great level and a grand scale. There's thousands of people that are arrested in the United States and that disappear for a while. Guantanamo is opened to create a sort of situation where you don't have to go through any due process, nothing. You can just accuse people and imprison them for decades, torture them, and have no process, legit legal process around it whatsoever. In the Arab region itself, the notion of terror starts facilitating the expansion of domination and colonial and imperial expansion. So on the colonial front, on the settler colonial front, it allows for the Israelis to suggest that their fight against the Second Intifada is a fight against terror. So they, and this is where it becomes impossible to even talk in any rational way about any Palestinian Islamic formation, even ones that have nothing to do with Qaeda, like Hamas or like Islamic Jihad. They are not Salafi jihadi. Let's be very clear. They don't come from the same background as Qaeda or any of these groups that the US sponsored in Afghanistan and that later it went into war with. Like in the case of Palestine, these are originally Muslim Brotherhood formations. They had their own outlook on the world. Okay, it's very different. There are movements that are concerned with achieving independence, but under an Islamic banner, which puts them on the right in Palestinian politics when it comes to questions of secularism. But they're definitely within the mainstream of Palestinian politics when it comes to their demand for anti-colonial independence. Okay, and yes, these movements tended to focus on armed struggle in the 90s and 2000s, but let's not forget that up till 1980s, they never adopted armed struggle. Okay, so for them, this is a strategy and a tactic, not a principle, as is often presented. That Hamas, these people are permanent jihad, this and that. That is not the basic premise of how they work. They do think that Palestine is an Islamic waqf. They do think that Palestine is sacred land. However, they also say, even in their latest charter, and I think people actually should read it, Daniel, because people talk about Hamas charter all the time. Well, read the updated one because it's more relevant. But, in there they do talk about, well, Muslims, Jews, and Christians should be able to coexist. Our problem is not with Jews. This is not a religious problem with Jews. Okay, so, and again, I'm not a fan of any religious organization, including Hamas. I come from a Palestinian left tradition. You know my politics, Daniel. But we have to be serious and honest, and in order to be able to deal with this world we live in. And what the war on terror did was that it created an atmosphere of fear and irrationality. You're not allowed to talk and contextualize or historicize or analyze any movement in Palestine in any serious way, because the purpose is to perpetuate domination, and to then do that by just saying these are terrorists. We don't talk about them in a real way. We don't talk with them. We don't talk. That's it. So it's a continuation of what they were doing against the PLO in the 70s, but they didn't have the religious argument at the time. They were just saying, oh, these are just violent terrorists. We don't negotiate with terrorists. But Henry Kissinger captured the essence of this when he said that they should never have a seat on the table. That's really what it's all about. So the war on terror allowed for that to happen in Palestine, also paved the way, of course, then for the invasion of Iraq, which was a disaster.
And just before we get to that, we should note that the war on terror framework was also extremely convenient for authoritarians across the region, very much including U.S. allies.
It was convenient for authoritarians. It was convenient for racists in the United States because they cracked down on Muslim and Arab communities and racialized the hell out of them. They racialized us extremely in this country. And then it also allowed for major repression across the Middle East. And of course, much of that was also funded by the US as well. There was all these torture and detention centers that were set up in Pakistan and Jordan, elsewhere. And it was done with coordination and sometimes funding and training in the US. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that there had not been a Salafi jihadi current and that it's not a problem in the region. Yes, that current did emerge after the US and its Saudi junior partner decided during the Afghanistan war to promote this way of thinking and to promote this ideology and and also, of course, this coincided with the US actually expanding this ideology, and we'll talk about it in a second now, after the Iraq War. They actually helped expand it and enhance it.
Let's talk about that. The 2003 US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. Unlike the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq was deeply divisive within the United States and broadly opposed by world leaders. First, what did the U.S. overthrowing Saddam Hussein's government and then occupying Iraq and imposing its own regime, what did that all reflect in terms of the development of this long history of Western imperialism in the Arab East, where that had arrived by March 2003? And then what did Iraq's conflict with the West, getting to the point of a U.S. invasion, what did that then say about the Iraqi regime? Iraq had, of course, once been a center of revolutionary movements and home to probably the most significant communist party in the Arab East. What did the invasion reflect about what had happened to Iraq, something that we've returned to repeatedly? And finally, what more generally were the consequences of this murderous, incredibly destructive war for Iraq and for the entire region?
Well, I'm gonna actually do an unusual move and talk about grand strategy for a second, and look at Iraq from a longue durée perspective. What function does it play in this region when it comes to long-term security considerations by imperialists and everybody else? Okay, so Iraq historically has been one of three major powers that have a bearing on the Gulf region, which means the richest oil repositories. But even before the discovery of oil, it was part of three major powers. You always had a power in Najd in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the organized forces of centralization there, could threaten the Gulf and could expand into it. And we've seen that when we were discussing the Saudi movement, and the Ikhwan movement, and what was referred to as Wahhabism, which did expand from the interior, from Najd, all the way to the Gulf. Then you have Iraq, which previously was, of course, the Ottomans. It was the main Ottoman entry point into the Gulf region. But later on, of course, it became its own independent force, initially under the British, but then later, it established its own rule under both Hashemite monarchy and later on subsequent republics that we've also discussed in detail. And then you have Iran, of course. So the regional balance of power depends on these three powers when it comes to the Gulf primarily. If you come and remove one of them, in particular Iraq, which had always played the function of a buffer zone in a way, even in Ottoman times, it was the buffer zone with the Persian Empire, between the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Later on in subsequent years, it played this role, and that role was very explicit during the Iran-Iraq War. The whole argument was that Iraq was going to be the shield that protects the Gulf from potential Iranian expansion. Now, the minute you remove that from the map, you destabilize the whole structure. And this is why it was quite an astonishing and a bold move to do. Even those that will tell you this was done to control Middle East oil, it's not a very convincing argument, because they were already controlling Gulf oil. They were already controlling it. They have the companies there, but they also have the regimes that are aligned with the Western agenda and are amenable to it. There's a lot of Western influence over oil there, and there's already American bases at that stage across the region as a result of the first Gulf War. When it comes to Iraq, they're controlling Iraqi oil because they had this oil for food program that they had instituted during the 1990s as they were besieging Iraq and starving its people. By the way, this is The sanctions regime was disgusting. That's why I'm against sanctions everywhere, except when they're imposed on settler colonial states. And even then, I'm not sure that food starvation is the way to do it anywhere, which is exactly what they were doing here. They were starving the people of Iraq. Anyways, this situation meant that they were coming in with a very bold idea. We're going to change this whole thing. And there were policy people that were enthusiastic about this in Washington. For obvious reasons, the Israeli crowd liked it. For other reasons, you had neocons of various colorings supporting it. There was definitely a military-industrial complex love for it. This war cost $3 trillion, Daniel. And that money went somewhere, And that regime was filled with those characters. I mean, come on. You can't tell me that Halliburton has nothing to do with this. Who's the vice president? Cheney is the vice president. I mean, their interests in these companies are so explicit. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like, you can't make this shit up, Daniel. Like, sometimes I think about it and I'm like, wow. And they go and they're like, yeah, we're going to invade this place. We're going to launch this forever war. They're knowing very well it will destabilize the regional map. They talk today about Iran and they're talking about Iranian menace and expansion and this and that. Well, why was Iran able to actually achieve major strategic gains in the region? By the way, I would never vilify Iran or any other state in the region, but they keep on for them, Iran is the devil, supposedly. Okay, so they're saying, it expanded. Well, you removed the main buffer zone. And in the process, you also sectarianized the politics of that space because you came in, imposed the worst constitution in the history of the region. Who imposes a constitution that is inspired by the Lebanese one? A total failed experiment. We talked about it. Sectarian madness that produces nothing but permanent civil wars and conflicts, internal conflicts. When you come and start saying, we're not going to think of Iraq as made up of Iraqi citizens. We're going to divide them into Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, and then other minorities. And we're going to lock them into this and box them into these identities that they'll never be able to escape from.
This is a profoundly sick irony of the whole thing, is that Shia Sunni sectarianism becomes the dominant interpretation in the US and probably the whole West, for all I know, for what's wrong with Iraq, even though it is imperialism and specifically the US invasion of Iraq that so lethally sectarianizes Iraqi politics.
Absolutely, Daniel. Sectarianism had never been legalized in places like Iraq until the US shows up. It was not a recognized political or legal category. It was practiced sometimes on a social level. And sometimes when people would analyze politics, they'd see it as, okay, it's playing a role in the background. It has a role to play, people's affiliations and networks and whatever. Okay, you could say that some of that existed at certain moments, and there were countercurrents against it. But once you come in and formalize it, institutionalize it, can you imagine if voting in the US were to be done on the basis of sectarian quotas? And you come and say Protestants will have this number of seats and Catholics will have this number of seats, and then minorities like Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists will have this number of seats, and atheists, they're not going to even be counted in this, and let's have elections run that way. That will be a formula for madness. It will mess up the country forever. This is basically what they did in Iraq. It destroyed the possibility of creating common citizenship. And then, of course, what they do is they bring in back the Iraqi opposition parties that were close to the Iranian authorities and that were in exile in Tehran. And these are, of course, because they were influenced by the Iranian Revolution and so on, they were Shia sectarian parties.
Like Dawa.
Like Hizb Dawa, for example. Okay. Now, they're coming back, and in the meantime, what you're doing is you're under the banner of de-Baathification. You're removing essentially the entirety of the Sunni officer class from the army. They're changing the whole security structure.
And you're dismantling the state, essentially.
And you're dismantling the state. So you're doing two things. You're dismantling the state, but also you're fanning the flames of a sectarian war. Because your whole theory is premised on the notion that there's a Sunni dominant order, therefore it has to be dismantled. And once you start doing that, what you end up facilitating is an attraction in Sunni areas towards theories like Salafi jihadism that will emphasize this notion of a permanent war against both crusaders, which means essentially the US Army in this case, but also the Shia local forces that were now being seen as replacing them in power. So you create a clash now. And we start seeing then suicide bombings in Iraq. We start seeing these attacks. Of course, we also start seeing resistance against the US forces as well. So there's this combination of factors that's going on that's very complicated. But there's an additional factor that also leads to further complications, which is what happens with the Kurdish movement, which was now seeing its main pathway as an alliance with the US. Okay, and it thought that it could gain independence or at least a high level of autonomy under that alliance. It did achieve the latter. They were supported by this structure. They got their sector within it, but they're trying to expand both territorial gains, mainly focusing on the oil-rich area of Kirkuk. That becomes a conflict zone between them and the central Iraqi state, which was now dominated, of course, by the Shia forces. By the way, I hate using these ethnic and religious terms. Unfortunately, the US forced us into them because that's how it functions today, the system. And then, of course, there was the other issue of what is to be done in relation to the question of Kurdish independence. Were they going to become an independent state? Were they not? The US never had the intention, of course, of facilitating that for them because it has to take account of Turkey, also other regional states that would not want to see this happen, including Iran. So it's a complex map that takes place. What it does on a regional level, besides fanning the flames of sectarianism, is that it regionalizes the sectarianism. So from the perspective of the Gulf, they start reading this as Iran now has gained Iraq via the Shia forces that have come into government. And now Saudi Arabia has to therefore support and facilitate. Initially, they work on this, some of the Salafi jihadi Sunni groups. But then, of course, when they find that that's going out of their control, they withdraw from that, okay? In the meantime, you have a weird phenomena where Assad has to support the same groups. And these are groups that, for historic reasons and tribal reasons, exist in the region between Syria and Iraq. It's an extension of the Jazeera region in Syria. There's big tribal alliances there. They're Sunni in background, but they're also mobile and they have capacity at launching, attacks, and they could organize well. Assad is concerned at this stage that the Americans are going crazy. They had been talking about failed Arab states, and including Syria and Iraq, in this category for a while, since the 90s, since the Clinton years. They've been talking about reshuffling the regional order as a whole. And by the way, the bit that we did not mention in this equation is that they were raising the banner of democratization as part of this. They were heralding this war on terror as the beginning of a new golden era of democracy. What exactly that democracy means, we don't know. What it meant was obviously sectarianism and constant war and the disintegration of the state. But in order to protect himself from this, what Assad does and what the security state does in Syria is to support the Salafi jihadist groups in Iraq as well, which is quite weird. But it's one of these situations that we've seen over and over again in this episode. When it comes to geostrategic interest, states will do weird deals like that. That's so that the Americans would be busy fighting these forces and would reconsider this notion, should they ever consider it, of invading Syria after invading Iraq.
In January 2011, what became known in the West as the Arab Spring took off with Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution, which forced the authoritarian, repressive president Ben Ali from power. And the revolts then, of course, spread to Egypt and beyond. Before we get to why things fell apart and ended so tragically in so many places, let's talk about why these uprisings started. What were the concrete conditions stretching from the Maghreb through the Mashriq that caused these mass uprisings to explode when they did and how they did? And then how would you describe these movements' ideological and sociological character?
So once again, I think these are this question invites a multifactorial answer. But from the onset, Daniel, I want to apologize to our listeners because we don't have much time, and I could go on as you know for hours talking about all of this.
Oh, I know.
So it's going to be brief, and we're not going to be able to cover everything. But the honest truth is that you have a culmination of the factors that we've been discussing all along. There was the question of neoliberalism is a big one. And here the class dimensions are very important to consider. There has been a lot of pressure on the entire regional economic order since we had the shift from socialism, or at least a espousal of socialist policies, to the new world that these states were living in the 2000s. And not all of these states had socialism in them, but they all had some level of state intervention in the economy, and that produced mixed results, but that benefited certain classes in society, particularly the working class, but also the lower middle class. And you had this now situation where this was no longer the case. There was privatization everywhere. The Washington Consensus was being imposed on this region systematically since the 1980s, as it had been imposed on the rest of the global South. Everybody was experiencing this phenomenon. This was coinciding with major geopolitical setbacks that we've discussed throughout. It was also coinciding with a crisis of legitimacy. There was a legitimation crisis politically as a result of the increasing turn towards political repression across the region for reasons that, again, we've discussed extensively. So you had a democratic deficit across the region. And it was coinciding with the persistence of settler colonial questions like Palestine, which added to the legitimation crisis of these regimes, but also to radical regional changes that did not benefit anyone in this part of the world, that created destabilization in the aftermath of the Iraq War, in the aftermath of all what had happened during the war on terror. So all these factors were coalescing together. And if you want to think about it in very simple terms, and I think sometimes complexity is best expressed in simplicity. What does it mean to be an Arab citizen belonging to the lower middle class or the working class in this period? It means basically less income, political disillusionment because you have no say in politics, a lot of anger at the imperialist and colonial assaults that you witness affecting your sisters and brothers elsewhere in places like Palestine, Iraq, and elsewhere. A general sense of disillusionment, politically and economically and socially. And it's not coincidental then that you have a Tunisian citizen, who gets humiliated by the police and attacked, and then decides to set himself on fire. A working class, citizen sets this whole movement into explosion. An ordinary working class Tunisian man burning himself becomes the torch, the literal torch that sets this whole prairie on fire. And in addition to the suffering that was witnessed by the working classes and the lower middle classes, even the more upwardly mobile new social classes that had something to benefit from privatization and so on, and the ones that made money out of tech or whatever. And often, by the way, sometimes there is this whole discourse of it being driven by those classes. This whole like it's a Facebook revolution and all of that. I don't subscribe to that theory. I think that's a very when you confuse a medium of organizing with the actual causational factors that led to the organizing, then you have a problem. Yes, Facebook was the medium at the time that was used initially, especially in Tahrir Square in Egypt, right after Tunisia. But that does not tell you that it's just techies starting the whole thing. It's just the medium offered a convenient space for that. But there's many factors that go behind that influence it. But even in those sectors, and of course the middle classes showed up in large numbers, and even members of the upper classes even showed up. Not all of them, but some of the younger ones, some of the ones that wanted to be cool, some of the ones that were educated and so on. They were looking at this from the prism of liberal rights. So that's why I say it's multifactorial, because every social class had something at stake here. Okay. The other dimension is that there's a crisis within the local ruling arrangement, within the state itself, within the security state itself. And, both Zain al-Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak had been ruling for a long time. They both were reaching a stage where they were not fully keeping the original ruling coalition around them happy. Definitely in the case of Mubarak, this had a lot to do with the politics of succession and him trying to impose on the army the idea of his son succeeding, which was a deeply unpopular idea. So you have this internal fight within the security state itself that also is an important part of the story. In a way, everybody had some grievance with the existing regimes in these places. Different social classes had different grievances. These events united a lot of social classes initially. But then, of course, some of them last, some of them don't. Now, one last factor, and I know we don't have time to cover all the factors, Daniel, is also you have local grievances with the security order in these different states. Long-term grievances with the cops, with the police structure, with heavy-handed intervention in citizens' lives, with the bullying and intimidation and humiliation that came with that as well. And we saw that again in different parts of Egypt and in Tunisia and elsewhere. Often it was like police stations, different organs of the state that were involved in that level of controlling people's lives that became the targets of so much attack. And in the meantime, people were very wary of how to deal with the militaries, even though, of course, the military was the backbone of the state in each one of these cases. But that created a sense of fear and how to deal with it, and different protest movements then dealt with the military in very delicate ways across these spaces.
I want to talk about why the Arab Spring fell apart in the way that it did, leading in some places to such horrible outcomes, so contrary to the desires and aspirations of the protesters. In Egypt, the protest movement initially led to Mubarak's fall, and then ultimately elections in a Muslim Brotherhood government. But that was ultimately overthrown by a military dictatorship even more brutal than Mubarak's. In Syria, Libya, and Yemen, protest movements turned into civil wars, and ultimately those wars involved military intervention, much of it Western, but also intervention from Gulf states and Russia. Even Tunisia, for a long time, framed as the Arab Spring's sole long-term success story. Tunisia, too, in recent years has morphed into an authoritarian government. What is your assessment of why all of these protest movements that were so inspiring in the moments that they took off ended in all of the various catastrophic ways that they did?
First of all, there's no general theory possible in that way, like in my view. We can have some general views about this, but there are limitations to each one of these analyses. And each analysis has to look at the local space very carefully, but also the specific geopolitical sphere of intervention around it. So let's start by distinguishing between spaces like Egypt and Tunisia, in which the regimes fell, or at least the ruling figures in the regimes fell. Zain al-Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak. In those two places, they fell because the internal structure that had supported them within the state did not actually have consensus on their continuation and was not willing to fight the broad popular mobilizations and to clash with them beyond a certain point. So initially there was crackdown. The security state did intervene in both spaces. They killed a lot of people. Actually, it was not a entirely like bloodless, change of government. It was very tense, of course. But at the end, after sustained mobilization, these people fall within a relatively short period of time, which meant that there was a decision within the security establishment and within the state to dispose of them and to open the space for a different process that would engage with the protesters in a certain way. Now, in both of those states, the two figures in question did not depend on just sectional support from a particular sectarian, tribal, or regional base. So these were figures that were supported by the militaries and the security services and the intelligence services, but their actual popular base of support was not restricted to a particular tribe or region or a sect. Okay, so their social basis of power is completely different. They essentially were candidates that were well placed within the security structure, had achieved leadership roles within it, and then were able to carry out its interests for the period in which they reigned. Beyond that, they were replaceable. The problem is different in Libya, okay, where you have a sectional, regional, and tribal basis for the Gaddafi order. It's different in Syria, and it's also very different in Yemen. Now, this is, by the way, just one area. In each of these places, there's, again, multiple dynamics. And I'll give you an example from Syria in more detail in a second, because I think Syria is in particular worth talking about in this case. It breaks the momentum around the Arab Spring. Okay, but in all of those three places, there was no breakdown in the internal state coalescence of forces around the ruler, in a way. Syria, whether we're talking about Syria or Libya, Gaddafi had the army behind him. It was in operation, okay, and it was cracking down on the protests. Same was happening in Syria, despite defections. So you do have defections in these places, but overall, the security establishment is fairly unified, and it's intact around this question. In Libya, the only reason why it falls is of NATO intervention. Otherwise the regime would have just committed lots of massacres, suppressed the popular uprisings, and it would have been done. And it was utilizing the war on terror discourse that we just referred to. Because the unifying feature, again, and across the region at this stage, is precisely because of the story we told in the dig of the fall of the left. We told the story of the rise and fall of the left, essentially. We spoke about an era in which the left was dominant. Everybody was a socialist in the 60s and 70s. But by the time we get to the 80s and 90s, that's it. The only organized form, actually, it's not entirely accurate to say that these things were horizontalist. You had an organized political force, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, in all of these zones, okay? And then you have, and it's a big and popular force, but it's sectional. It has a section of the population organized under it. It doesn't have the full population. And then you have others that are outside that sphere that are acting in horizontalist ways. And you have leftists in all of these places trying to regain and organize themselves. Okay, but the Brotherhood is prominent in each one.
That's why the Brotherhood is able to advance beyond where the more kind of secular-oriented youth protesters who are initiating a lot of these protest movements, but not able to move beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a standard view, and everybody knows it in the Arab region. I mean, it's like that the Brotherhood was organized, and these youth were still trying to find an organizational formula. The problem becomes actually how the Brotherhood deals with them in ways that are harmful for themselves and for these youth. So that especially in Egypt, that's a big story. Now, I'll tell you something, Daniel. In the run-up to the Arab Spring, there had been in Arab intellectual circles, and I know this story very well because I was part of a lot of those discussions, there were a lot of discussions between the left, the nationalists, and the Islamists about creating a historic bloc. I remember in particular Ragid al-Sulh and people like Ali al-Kawari. These were two former Ba'athist intellectuals, one from Qatar and one from Lebanon. Ragid unfortunately passed away. He was a wonderful and very kind man. But anyways, they used to convene these sessions where all these figures would meet. I've attended some of them. I mean, and we'd have discussions about a Gramscian historic bloc that would include all of these different forces against the power of the dictatorial state. But of course, the problem on the ground was that the only really organized force amongst them was the Brotherhood. So what ended up happening was a set of complicated relationships that, in the case of Egypt, were catastrophic, for example. Again, Tunisia is a slightly different story. Now, with Syria is an entirely different story altogether. And there, the issue is not simply horizontalism or lack thereof. I mean, it's a different equation altogether.
Let's talk about the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011 and has been ongoing in various forms as we speak for more than 13 years. We focused on Syria so much throughout Thawra, from the French colonial mandatory government to the 1949 U.S. coup, through everything that followed with the rise of the Ba'ath Party being taken over by Hafez al-Assad's military wing and beyond. What were the conditions in Bashar al-Assad's Syria? Bashar, of course, being the son of Hafez. What were the conditions in Syria and in the region that led to Syria's protest movement emerging and then to Assad's brutal repression of that movement and then to it all spiraling into a civil war in the way that it did, a civil war that included ultimately so many domestic and foreign actors? And the conflict in Syria, of course, alongside the U.S. invasion of Iraq, that also led to the emergence of the Islamic State, or ISIS. But we'll discuss ISIS separately at greater length in a moment.
So Syria is a good example of the crisis of neoliberalism that I just spoke about. During the Hafez days, one of the ways the state was able to maintain a social base beyond the narrow sectarian base that Hafez had around his security establishment was through giving a good deal for the countryside. And what that meant was very decent cooperatives, agricultural programs that supported small farmers. Syria was a state actually that under the Ba'ath invested heavily in the countryside, in the agricultural sector, as well as in the industrial sector. So it did both, which is quite interesting. And its agricultural model was fairly successful for a good while. However, under the Hafez regime in the 90s, you began to see a shift towards some greater openings for private enterprise and greater privatization. And, it was done with some hesitance. It wasn't done comprehensively, but it was beginning. So there were a set of there was a 5-year plan that kind of was geared towards that, but then it wasn't done comprehensively. By the time we get to Bashar, he adopts this policy on a much bigger scale. So we start seeing the rise of about 100 characters they are called the group of the 100, that they do emerge at this stage. There's a great book in Arabic, but it's unfortunately not available in English on this, that tells the story brilliantly. It's written by the most brilliant Syrian scholar and the one that has the greatest knowledge of Syrian history, Muhammad Jamal Barut, my friend. But that tells you the story with such detail. Like these people come in, their investments they gain like significant ground in the Syrian economy. In the meantime, the support for the countryside declines substantially. And what that leads is an economic crisis in the countryside. Now, it coincides also with this decade of so-called neoliberal reforms under Bashar coincides with a drought that affects agriculture in the countryside. So there's these environmental factors that lead to further degrading of economic life in those areas. It coincides also with the suppression of a nascent democratic experiment that was supposed to emerge initially in the early years of the Bashar reign. There had been a brief period known as the Damascus Spring. He had announced himself as somebody who's going to bring in a new era with greater political freedoms.
He was educated in the UK, I believe, and he and his wife were a bit of a darling of the Western media briefly as modernizers.
Yeah, I mean, he married a Syrian woman who was from London, and he himself was briefly educated in the UK. By the way, like most of his education was in medical school in Damascus, but he went and did specialty there and could speak English. Was presentable to this Western world. Okay, but it's never about that really, Daniel. As we know, this is all like racist thinking. I mean, there was flourishing democratic thinking in the Arab region for a long time. It was actually suppressed by the West. It's not that you go to the West and you learn democracy and come back. It's quite the opposite, actually, most of the time. So in any case, you have this situation where this Damascus Spring emerges, but then he cracks down on it immediately. So politically, we have a continuation of the repressive order, but without the economic compensation that used to come with that, especially for the rural areas. And this is why you start seeing the explosion of the revolt in Syria, precisely in those areas. It's not driven by the major urban centers, not the big ones. In Damascus and Aleppo, the mobilizations are fairly limited. There are mobilizations, but they are fairly limited compared to what was going on in the countryside, but also the major provincial cities that had been affected by this. So Hama, they have their own history with the regime. We have discussed before. Homs, it's of course a major industrial center, but also it is not Damascus. It is not where the big bourgeois interests are concentrated. It has its own interests as well, and it has industrial interests and so on, but it also has classes that are affected by this situation. But it's predominantly very marginalized areas, like the countryside around Thawra. That's where it starts. Thawra is in the southernmost part of Syria. It is in the Hauran Valley, where the grain production, a lot of it happens there. It is the region that is close to the Jordanian border. It is also a region with a high level of tribal social organization. And the Syrian regime, during the beginnings of the Arab Spring, essentially one of the security forces ends up killing a young schoolboy there for writing something against the regime, and they end up getting tortured and killed, a young schoolboy. That leads to social outrage. People start going out on demos. Now, initially, one section of the regime was telling them, we're going to negotiate with you. So you have the prime minister and so on being like, oh, let's see your demands and whatever. And in the meantime, another section, the army was sent to suppress it. And they go so heavy-handed in the suppression, even though they had just promised a nice deal to the people of Thawra, that it goes out of control. The crackdown happens so huge that it makes people want to have vendetta. But of course, this is not a people that had been experiencing economic boom. They've been experiencing economic decline. They felt the effects of these years of neoliberalism. And suddenly, of course, it all goes up to the surface. These things don't happen mechanically, Daniel. When we speak of social classes, that's one thing I enjoy about being a historian. And I do very much believe in the role of class in the making of history. But it never happens mechanically. in the moment it happens through, like, all the grievances suddenly get activated by these processes, but they've been in the making for years before, and then they explode, and that's how you end up with a situation like what happened in Dara. So the repression adds to the explosion, and then it adds to the spread of the movement elsewhere. Now, the character of the movement as it spreads becomes diffuse. In each region, it spreads under a different banner. In some areas where the old Nasirists were strong, you have Nasirists playing that role locally, whatever was left of them. In a lot of areas where the Brotherhood, which has always had a big presence, and although it was defeated by the regime, it still has networks, they resurface and they start organizing their own ranks. And then you get this diffuse kind of formations emerging. But the most interesting thing that happens initially is that you get all these amazing local committees in the early days of the revolt, when it was actually potentially a revolutionary phenomena. So this is the era that we could speak of as Syrian revolution. And like the first year had so many different expressions of popular mobilization locally. You had these coordination committees emerging on the ground, and dependent on the energies of a new generation of people that were discussing both political ideas, but also they were driven by social and economic justice grievances. And of course, the political ideas predominated in the discussions. The idea of, like, the political rights and so on predominated in that. But there was also a huge amount of social justice orientation and economic justice orientation in all of this. And of course, we see here also the effects of the environmental justice deficit in our world, because of this drought didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the enormous global warming that is going to affect the Arab world disproportionately, because it's one of the regions that will be worse affected by this. So all of this comes together. Now, the geopolitical forces suddenly start entering the scene.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners, who support us at patreon.com, and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Exit Wounds: How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border by Yeva Jasunta. Turning the familiar story of trafficking across the U.S.-Mexico border on its head, Exit Wounds looks at firearms smuggled from the United States into Mexico, urging us to understand the ricochet effects that lax U.S. gun laws have abroad. Jasunta provides a rare, intimate look into the world of firearms trafficking by weaving together gripping stories of people who live and work with guns in both Mexico and in the U.S. An expert work of narrative nonfiction based on years of fieldwork, Jasunta expands current debates about guns in America, grappling with U.S. complicity in violence on both sides of the border. Learn more about Exit Wounds by Yeva Jasunta at ucpress.edu. So how does this dynamic of variegated mass movement across all of these different regions of Syria, this dynamic of mass movement met with regime oppression, how does that finally tip into civil war? And then what role does the regionalization and internationalization of Syria's domestic conflict play into tipping this dynamic into an outright civil war?
So the question here has to do with the initial choices that were made. So initially, of course, when these local committees were done, these were not about and did not have the capacity to launch an armed struggle against the regime. So often, as in other zones of the Arab Spring, they were emphasizing their peaceful character and so on, and that they were going to do essentially mass disobedience, creating levels of local autonomous organizing, was going to be the way forward that will lead eventually to the collapse of the regime. Multiple mass disobedience movements everywhere. And of course, because this was happening spontaneously, it wasn't like there was even like one theorization center that was saying this is the way we're going to do it. It's just the way it worked out. But symbols and slogans like the idea of it's going to be silmiya, it's going to be peaceful, whatever, were raised in different places. The geopolitical factor comes in, one, in the form of the call for an armed movement. Okay, so that's one area. And of course, the regime had been talking about that even before such a movement emerged. They were saying these are armed terrorists that are causing like whatever, and we're going to fight the terror. They were using the war on terror discourse from even before there was any major armed clash going on. Okay, but in the meantime, already there was an external dimension led in the initial media wars. So the main media network that was covering the Arab Spring at the time was owned by Qatar. It was Al Jazeera. And we cannot minimize its role. It did actually cover it. I was following at the time. Everybody that was following knew that, the media does have an impact. Once you cover people protesting in different places, if you give a prominent role to that, it can encourage others to do the same. And they definitely, Jazeera covered Tunisia very closely, and they did the same in Egypt, and they were covering the protests favorably. They had been clashing with the regimes earlier by doing programming that was encouraging ideas of political reform since the establishment of Jazeera from, I think 1996, I believe. That was a brand they were trying to promote. And in a way, it's an interesting brand because Jazeera represented Qatar's attempt to present itself somehow promoting somewhere an ideology that is somewhere between, that is a melange of reconstituted old Arab nationalism / ideas of the left and so on, mixed with Muslim Brotherhood. And their early figures had a lot of Muslim Brotherhood people in them, but they also had some people from former leftist parties and so on. So it was like this interesting mix between the two. And the common ground between all of them was that they were, of course, all opposed to these regimes. In the meantime, like Jazeera comes in and it's seen as representing, a state like Qatar, which runs the world's largest, or one of the, I think it is the largest American base, certainly in the region. Al-Udeid base is huge, massive. The whole command is done there for the region. It's like a massive structure. And it's heavily involved within the American, of course, regional equation. But at the same time, it is promoting through its media organs this line, and also through its policy, it's definitely seen as close to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's one area. So initially, you start getting the Syrian regime claiming that this is a Qatari game, and they start playing silly games like saying, "Oh, we've just proven that Jazeera distributes drugs to these protesters." I mean, I was watching Syrian official television at the time, and they put pictures of like plastic bags with like, I don't know, aspirin pills in them or something. And the plastic bag would have Jazeera logo on it. They're like, yeah, see, we found the proof. So you had this issue, this was the beginning of starting to say these protests are encouraged by these Gulf regimes as part of a conspiracy against Syria for being the staunch anti-imperialist state. That's the beginning of that narrative. Of course, Qatar had its own reasons to support these revolutions. It had a strategic alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood. It would have gained significantly in terms of regional power and influence through that, and that's a different conversation. But in the meantime, what's peculiar about Syria is that you have also regional powers that were not too keen on the Arab Spring as a whole, particularly Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but that take a unified stance on the fall of the Assad regime. And of course, that for them has to do with the Iranian angle. Syria and Iran have this strong alliance, and it was seen as, since the Iraq War and the American sectarianization of Iraq that we spoke about, and the American entry into Iraq, the whole regional security theory of places like Saudi Arabia was that there had been now a Shia crescent extending all the way from Tehran to Beirut, passing through Baghdad and Damascus, And essentially, they have to break that at any cost possible. Fall of Assad in Syria would have facilitated that for them and would have added to their regional credit. So they have their own regional interests in that. The Turks have their own regional interests. They have had a close rapprochement with Assad for many years before that. Now they're seeing Erdogan, who is close to the Muslim Brotherhood also, but also worried about the Kurds in Syria, worried about all sorts of things. It's a complicated regional game. He wants to have also, he's seeing that this tide of the Arab Spring is rising. He doesn't want to miss out. There's many different factors going on. He decides to also engage, and he sees this as an opportunity to spread Turkish influence. It already had incredible Turkish access to Syrian markets under Assad. So everybody has a piece in this pie. And in the meantime, of course, you have the coalition that wants to keep Assad in place. So Iran needs Assad in place for its geopolitical reasons. Its allied regional forces, especially Hezbollah, need it immensely. It cannot function without it. And it has depended on it as a major supply line for years. So this becomes a question of geopolitical interests. And that's a world that's completely different from the world that led initially to the rise of the revolution. You also had the social forces within Syria that were allied or came to become allied with the regime. Of course, it has its traditional base within the security forces and so on, and the regions they come from. It has a traditional base amongst Alawi communities. But by the way, we shouldn't overstate the sectarian dimension here, because some Alawis were also initially indicating, especially some Alawi intellectuals, were like, well, we don't like this. Other minorities, which came to be seen as close to the regime later on, Druze and Christians and so on, some of their intellectuals were big promoters of social change in Syria. People like Michel Kilo was one of the main symbols of the intellectual period of the Damascus Spring, and he was being regularly cited in this period. But you do have then a social base that the regime tries to consolidate amongst the minorities, saying, look, this is about Islamic fundamentalism gaining power. If they gain power, you're going to be harmed. It's a combination ranging from the Muslim Brotherhood at the least level of harm to Salafi jihadi groups at the highest level. Do you want to be under that, or would you rather be under me? That was basically the situation that people were presented with. And of course, there were added factors that were being promoted at the time. Initially they were suggesting it's a conspiracy theory by Palestinian refugees. They even tried that. I remember Buthaina Shaban at the time, the spokesperson of the regime, she had been the information minister, coming out. And this is, again, a regime that premises its all existence on Palestine, supposedly. It was using that. It was saying this is a Zionist conspiracy as well. It comes in and says, it's Palestinian refugees in these camps that have started these protests. But after a while, after the first year, when initially the popular tide was difficult for the regime to completely paint as being just stooges, and it was spreading, the geopolitical factor actually becomes much more prominent. And the interventions from all of these corners and all of these states. We haven't even started to talk about the Americans, by the way. We're just talking now about the regional powers.
We just talked about how the Syrian Civil War, how the protest movement and the repression it was facing, how the sort of regionalization of that conflict tipped it into civil war. How then does the conflict become not just regionalized, but internationalized, with the United States beginning to play a really serious role?
Well, I mean, let me start by saying I don't like the word conflict in relation to it. I think in the initial year and a half of the time, it was pretty much a genuine Syrian revolutionary movement that drew on a popular base and that sought a broad range of demands, ranging from economic justice to political representation. But you have the defeat of that leads to descent to conflict. But throughout that period, in the initial time, it was essentially a very repressive regime, refusing to even take minor steps that could have, by the way, averted all of this. Had Bashar said, I will resign, I will hold parliamentary elections, I will hold presidential elections, I'm resigning, and so will my government, that could have led to a completely different kind of scenario. But that's not the way it worked. And of course, they clung to power. They essentially decided that they will not take the path of concessions. They will take a hardline path of severe repression. Now, the Americans come in, and of course, they're adding to the problem, because by playing this game of suggesting that they're pro somehow these movements, already they're implicating these movements with their bad baggage, terrible reputation. Okay. In the meantime, you have elements from these movements that start promoting working with them. And I'm not talking here about the grassroots. I'm talking about all these Syrians abroad networks and so on that start holding meetings with officials. And they have nothing to do with the village organizing that's happening, or the spontaneous movements, or the social justice struggles. But they want to ride this wave. And they start establishing their own structures. Some of these structures get sponsored by Americans. Some of them get sponsored by Turks. Some of them get sponsored by Emiratis, by Saudis, by everybody wants to have a role in this game and a horse in this race. That allows the regime to then claim that this is some international conspiracy going on. And of course, all of these Syrian opposition movements, some of them, by the way, not every person abroad was bad or animated by this. I'm talking about certain sections. But some of them do allow for the regime to come and paint the whole movement in a bad light. Because they start saying, yeah, we want to be stooges of American imperialism. We want the close alliance. They start using the American language. They even talk about peace, some of them talking about peace agreements with Israel, whatever, policies that are not popular in Syria. They start indicating that they don't care about big fights around the Golan. Syria has occupied territory from the Israeli state, very important occupied territory, the Golan Heights. So, you have this game emerging, which allows then, of course, the regime to paint this as an Israeli and an American campaign. In the meantime, the Israelis are sponsoring and supporting Salafi jihadist groups in this equation. And they make a big deal about it. Oh, they're treating them in their hospitals. They're facilitating their safe exit from Syrian territory. So it gets murkier and murkier as time goes by. And as more and more of these regional powers start entering. And in the meantime, the US plays a very harmful role. It keeps talking about regime change, essentially, and the fall of the regime. But it's not combining that with direct action. And in the meantime, though, it's arming certain groups connected to it.
Moderate rebels was the phrase.
Yeah, moderate rebels. So what they're doing essentially, and again, these are all matters of interpretation, and one day we'll have full access to the US records on it. But based on whatever we have now, the only theory that I see forward is that their main project was actually the destruction of the Syrian state, not the regime. It was about weakening the state itself. The key moments where the U.S. intervenes, and this is including under Obama in this period, his main intervention was around the chemical weapons moment. Remember it, Daniel? I'm sure you do, and some of our listeners would. It was about actually disarming the Syrian state of its only capacity at balancing Israeli nuclear power. And here, I'm not talking about the regime. I'm talking about the state itself. When it comes to that, they'll intervene and come say, okay, remove chemical weapons. It could be used against protesters. Of course, the regime would have potentially used them against protesters. It's nothing, this is not a good regime. I'm not advocating, for the regime here. But what I'm saying is, if we look at it structurally, they're enjoying the fact that the state is disintegrating and that you have this almost permanent civil war going on. And what it does is it exactly serves an interest that they had been long advocating for a long time, which is removal of Syria from the regional equation In Iraq, it was through direct invasion. Here, it was through riding on a genuinely popular revolution and militarizing that revolution, prolonging a war that throughout, by the way, not intervening in a way that would allow for regime fall or anything like that. These people were never interested in democratization. That is a fact. No U.S. state intervention in this part of the world has ever led to a democratization. That's something that we have to focus on when we're talking about this.
Let's turn to the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh. What is the Islamic State, and how did it emerge in the way and at the moment and in the places that it did? And in terms of origins here, I mean specifically, but not only, in terms of its emergence from al-Qaeda in Iraq. How did this all play out with IS seizing all that territory in Iraq and then Syria before ultimately getting beat back by an absolutely surreal coalition, including Assad-aligned Russian forces, the US-backed left-wing PKK-affiliated Kurdish People's Defense Units, the YPG, Iranian-backed militias, the Iraqi government allied with both the US and Iran. There was also Hezbollah, which intervened to support Assad. And then more broadly, what did it mean that it was this apocalyptic, fundamentalist, murderously sectarian group that dramatically tore down colonially imposed borders separating Iraq and Syria? That it was this group, rather than the radical nationalists who had long dreamed of a unified Arab nation, unified against imperialism and reaction. It really feels like this horrific and, again, surreal, grotesquely surreal moment when all of the accumulated contradictions of a century of imperialism and reaction just blew up in the most ugly, giant, bizarre way.
Yeah, let's not forget the context, Daniel. The U.S. killed hundreds of thousands in Iraq. It destroyed large sections of Iraq's cities and towns and villages through a war of imperial aggression that was not justified and had no legal basis, had no moral basis. In fact, it contravened every single moral and legal reasoning in this world. But it introduced a neo-colonial reality into the region. We should read the emergence of ISIS in that light. The de-Baathification that we spoke about, the so-called de-Baathification, which essentially was an anti-Sunni policy, resulted in large grievances amongst Sunni populations in Iraq, and it led to an attraction towards these kind of ideologies. The emergence of anti-Sunni Shia groups in Iraq. And it went both ways, by the way. I'm never going to justify any sectarian violence on the part of any group in any country. But in Iraq, you had that phenomena coming in, and you had this hubris that came out of the U.S. installing the Shia groups that had been basically very ultra-sectarian and had been in exile in Tehran. They come back, they give them the show, they start talking openly about this is a Shia majority country, we have to be in power. And they have different codes for that, okay? Now, again, this is not a sectarian description, it's just part of what happened. Of course, you had Sunni groups then attacking Shia mosques. It went both ways and it was horrible. Okay, but the byproduct was you start fanning the flames of the sectarian conflict. You create the structural conditions for it. And suddenly Iraq, which had never been a base of operations for any religious fundamentalist organization, be it Sunni or Shia, starts housing both Sunni and Shia religious fundamentalist organizations. I mentioned the second because it's erased from the discussion. There were Sunni neighborhoods in Baghdad that were completely eradicated. There were people killed because of their sectarian identity, because they belonged now to a minority that was seen as a vanquished one. Okay, so that led to rise of people organizing in certain Sunni areas under this ideological banner. Initially, the Saudis facilitated that. The Syrians, as I mentioned, contributed to it massively. And then, of course, it exploded in their faces. Because with the Syrians, they were doing it to give the Americans trouble, as we mentioned. But then suddenly, it's when the minute of the Arab Spring happens, they're going to have to deal with that form of organization. Now, initially, they don't mind. And actually, one of the curious realities of the Syrian revolution and later on civil war, after it descends into that, is that the clashes are not primarily between the regime and ISIS. They're between the regime and everybody else. So they have a weird working formula. And they actually, over the oil regions that get controlled by ISIS, the regime keeps relations going smoothly initially. ISIS was convenient for it because it could describe the whole thing as a war on terror. It could incorporate it into that language and discourse. And it could present it globally as that, including to its Russian allies, but also to other major powers globally. So you have this situation, and it could also use it for internal legitimation. Now, the other thing that's going on in this period is a culmination of the years of investment in this way of thinking that affects different communities throughout the region. Years of Saudi propaganda about Shiites taking over the region. Driven by anxiety over the fall of, again, Iraq, its transformation into an Iranian sphere of influence. The years of feeling marginalized and feeling that there's no political horizon. That was very fertile ground for the spread of these kind of ideas. But there's another factor, which is money. These groups are coming in with large amounts of money, and they're spending it. And this money is there because they've had state sponsors. And they have a mechanism for creating salaries and bringing in. And then there's a transnational dimension. Because they're group rooted in an ideology, it's an ideology that has been produced by initially the Afghanistan war and the Americans there, but then by the war on terror itself, it can draw on a lot of recruits. So all of these factors coalesce and they create this phenomena called ISIS. The regime in its initial time had also engaged in very strange set of activities that are strange but not so strange. There's a lot of prison stuff happening in the prisons that's very peculiar. It had been releasing Islamic fundamentalists from prison for quite a while because it was trying to create an enemy in its own image, in the image it wanted it. And then you have, of course, the Americans. And they're supporting different Islamic groups there. They're calling them moderate groups. But in fundamental terms, they're not that. They have a lot of similarities with that way of thinking, which does not help. And here I do have some disagreements. Of course, we have to call out the tanky analysis, which comes in and actually absorbs the language of the war on terror. It uses it without reservation in relation to this period. And of course, all what it's trying to do is to justify a dictatorial, murderous regime, under the guise of defending the region against imperialism. But in the meantime, there's another discourse, which includes discourse coming from respected intellectuals within the Syrian revolutionary circles. And they get, by the way, very, very sensitive around this. And it becomes almost impossible to have a conversation. Syria became very divisive around this. And it's partly because of this narrowing down of the space for public debate. Anything you say, they'll come and say, oh, you're attacking the revolution. I might be on the left, but there's Nusra there. I'm like, really? So we were dealing with that situation there. But these were the groups that were given the guns and the money and the support. And, it becomes such a mess. And the amount of horror that the Syrian people had to experience as a result of the imperialist intervention there, combined with the vicious regime's refusal to initiate any form of serious reform, to be able to contain the situation, or at least to yield to some popular demands, if not all, caused this horrendous tragedy, one of the worst tragedies of the 21st century. The majority of the countryside was destroyed. Millions of people were forced to leave the country was one of the largest refugee exoduses in percentage terms in history. Horrible situation. And Syria, Israelis were watching, having a great time with this because it removed one of their main potential balancing powers regionally. Not that it ever balanced that much, but it was, part of the balancing order in the region.
And even today, we see Syria divided under the control of multiple different forces. We see tens of thousands of family members of Islamic State or suspected Islamic State actors in sprawling prison camps with no prospect for a future. It's horrifically unfinished business.
It is horrifically unfinished business. I mean, you have, first of all, the regime had to be destabilized by external forces, in this case, Russia, Iran, and of course, Hezbollah. But then, of course, it faced a crisis within the Syrian minority populations that it claimed to be defending against ISIS in this period. So there are major protests this year in Druze areas, in Sueda and these areas. There are major protests in Alawi areas, which is the hardcore of the, regime heartland. This is where, by the way, also the kind of Sunni sectarian awful discourse that was being propagated on some of the Gulf news channels at the time is very upsetting, because they were often saying terrible things about minorities instead of trying to build a broad national coalition. At the time, I was shocked, and others, of course, that are of a progressive orientation and that are definitely opposed to the regime, but are also very opposed to sectarianism and very opposed to, falling into this trap, and that are cognizant of its use for both imperialism, but also for the perpetuation of forms of domination locally. We were watching with horror as people were talking about this, about these minorities in these terms. And unfortunately, it happened. There was a complete disintegration of the social order. And how do you recreate a national identity after that? Forget about the cultural losses. Syria is a beautiful place with enormous human treasures. The market of Aleppo alone, the loss of that is a disaster. The loss of things in Tadmur, in Palmyra, I'm not going to even recount. The loss of lives, even bigger, more important than anything, of course. The destruction of the environment, the ecosystem, unbelievable things happened there. So when we are talking about Syria, we have to always ground it in the human experience, beyond the vicious debates that took place. And I emphasize this on the dig because much of that vicious debate took place in the left, and it divided the left. I think it had actually very bad implications for the Arab left, what took place in Syria. There were major divisions taking place between pro-regime, anti-regime, and then also it had repercussions also on the American left. Within the Palestinian movement, we've had a difficult time dealing with it. This was actually the biggest challenge we've ever had. There's generally good clarity in the Palestinian movement because we have the clearest cause in the whole region. It's very difficult to misunderstand the Palestinian cause. But Syria created such an atmosphere of partisanship and toxicity in talking about things. And I'm like, how did we descend to a situation where we're pitting anti-imperialism against the fight for economic justice and political freedoms? How we ended up saying it's an either or, that's a question that both the American and the Arab left have to ask very seriously. We need to confront ourselves with these questions.
You talked about the intense divisions within the Palestinian movement. Over Syria, notably, there were also divisions within what we today see as the axis of resistance.
Yes. So Hamas politically, its overall strategy during the Arab Spring was to stand with the Arab Spring forces. And of course, that's because Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. After all, it has, some high degree of independence from them, but it is part of their, regional network and put its weight behind the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, of course, but also it allied itself with it in Syria. So in Syria, they played a role in Yarmouk camp, which is strategically important for Damascus. The fighting, for the most part, did not happen within Damascus proper. What was happening is the countryside around Damascus, which is to the south, this area called the Ghouta, which is traditionally the green space in Damascus, is where all these villages are. Those were rising in revolt. The urban core was not necessarily in revolt. That represents mercantile interests, other interests, and that's a whole conversation. But areas like Yarmouk are an important channel, an extension geographically, that could lead from these areas that were in revolt to the urban core. And Yarmouk camp was the largest Palestinian refugee camp in the world and the best one. Really, it looked like an urban neighborhood. It was prosperous. It had all sorts of trades and crafts and offices and different. It was a very creative camp. And there, Palestinian organizations like Hamas did decide to take a stance against the regime, even though traditionally, for a long time, they had an alliance with the regime. But at the time, Khalid Mish'al was in charge in Hamas. His view was Hamas has to put its weight behind the Arab Spring. That will be the exit for the Palestinian cause as a whole. His strategy was, if you have Muslim Brotherhood governments come into power, that will enhance Hamas's position within the Palestinian cause, but also it will allow for stronger advocacy for Palestine as far as Hamas was concerned. That's not the way it worked out. So it took a strong stance there, and that led then to a temporary collapse in its relationship, not only with Syria, of course, but also with, it led to a difficult situation with Iran. And that relationship was not reconstituted until years later, of course. Of course, after the defeat of the Arab Spring, you had a shift within Hamas politics. And that's a big part of the backstory to the rise of Yahya Sinwar into leadership. And of course, the decline of Khalid Mish'al, who was associated with the Arab Spring policy. So these events had far-reaching repercussions that are relevant even to what is going on today. And the really sad reality of all of this, Daniel, is that you have places like Yarmouk camp that were completely destroyed. This great Palestinian refugee camp that was a hub for Palestinian revolutionary thought and action, and a hub for Palestinian life. It was an example of how life in the Shatat, in the Palestinian exile, could still be committed to Palestine while actually flourishing and achieving economic and cultural gains for the people of Palestine outside. So this was a tragedy for the Palestinian people. And of course, other Palestinian camps across Syria suffered greatly. But Yarmouk had a symbolism to it. The destruction of the camp is so painful. And Palestinian refugees ended up, like the rest of the people of Syria, they ended up going into dispersal. They ended up going into all these places in Europe where they're now subjected to racist campaigns, of course. It's a big part of the story of global migration and anti-immigrant sentiment that has emerged also over the past while. So all of these things are interconnected, as you know. We cannot detach these factors from each other. The Syrian and Palestinian stories were so intermingled and so integrated, precisely because the Palestinians in Syria were such an important part of local society, and they were very well considered within it. But unfortunately, the destruction of Syria meant also the destruction of large parts of Palestinian life there.
Groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are often conflated with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. But in fact, of course, the landscape of Islamic religious organizations, movements, and parties, it's incredibly varied. Even the respective national chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood are considerably different in their politics, program, practice. For instance, Hamas, shaped by conditions of colonial resistance, Hamas is quite distinct from the Brotherhood in Qatar or Egypt. And Syria, as we discussed in the first part of this epilogue, the chapter there has its own particular history. And then these Sunni projects are, in turn, rather different from the Iran-led axis of resistance. A largely, but obviously not entirely, Shia formation, because it includes not only Hezbollah in Lebanon and Ansar Allah in Yemen, but also Hamas in Palestine, which again comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. How would you describe the current landscape of Islamic religious politics across the region? And how, notably, does what we see today look different from the sort of politics that the secular nationalist left once put forth as the solution to imperial domination?
Okay, so I think the primary distinction is between Islamic groups or groups that describe themselves as Islamic groups that subscribe to Salafi jihadist ideology and those that have a different ideology going back to reformist projects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They are very different and very distinct political projects. And of course, there were times in which they intersected, but more often than not, they diverged when it comes to serious both ideological presuppositions, but also strategic and tactical decisions. So when it comes to Salafi jihadists, it's difficult to explain them to an American audience without having this attraction of engaging in the analogy of Puritanism, almost. There's this puritanical vision of going back to an early glorious Islam. And this vision is often informed by notions that suggest that we're living in an age where the very essence of monotheism is challenged. So they're likely to be very iconoclastic. When people say, why do they destroy historical artifacts or statues and that sort of thing, they're very concerned about people worshiping idols other than God. They tend to engage in, not necessarily, by the way, but often tend to engage in what we would call takfiri practice, which means accusing people of lack of belief in God. And that tends to be an accusation hurled against other Muslims all too often. In particular, the current dominant streak in the ideology will often be focused on condemning the Shia versions of Islam. That has to do with contextual factors. In the recent period, this anti-Shia streak has been strengthened by the American invasion of Iraq, and then later on, of course, the entry of Iran more strongly in Iraq and the decline in Sunni power in that country. All of that contributed to this line of thought. In Syria, it manifests itself also in relation to this view that the country is ruled by a sect that is an offshoot of Shiism, the Alawi sect. And of course, this trend is very, very different in its outlook than the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood was an attempt to grapple with the encroachment of colonialism into the region. We spoke about that. Attempt to create some sort of formula for wedding Islam with modernity. It did suggest that we are living in an age of ignorance or jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic state, which was not a very good state of affairs. That's, of course, the theory that was put forth by Sayyid Qutb. He spoke about this, that we're living in the jahiliyyah, age of ignorance, and that return to Islam would be good for that. But what the return to Islam means in Brotherhood thought and practice is very different than what it means in Salafi jihadism. They're more interested in piety and spreading it in society. They're more interested in establishing civic organizations that create forms of social solidarity, again, centered around religion. They do a lot of philanthropic type of work. They're also, the relationship with the state is very different. Many points in their history, they opted for lack of a direct clash with the state. Sometimes they did clash with the state, but that was as a result of specific calculations. Sometimes they might have even engaged in violent forms of contestation with the state. I mean, their big clash with Nasser, our listeners might remember, happened when he felt that they were going to assassinate him. They did try. There was a failed assassination attempt. So, they have a history of being able to use methods like that. But in general, they rely on mass mobilization and they rely on spreading piety. Unlike Salafi jihadists, and by the way, combining the terms is important. Salafism alone does not mean that you're going to engage in Salafi jihadist activity. Salafi al-Jihadiyya means that you, in addition to embracing this puritanical vision, following Salaf al-Salih, they see themselves as part of a generational link. They came in later generations to continue the pathway of the earlier ones. Those guys also, for the Salafi jihadists, they're saying we have to engage in armed struggle to achieve our objectives. It could include attacks on the state. It could include attacks on civilians. It could include attacks on tourists. It could include attacks on Shia mosques. This is not the sort of way or method of conduct that the Muslim Brotherhood engages in. They're very purposive, the Muslim Brotherhood. They're much more, I don't like the use of this terminology of moderate and extreme, but they are less likely to emphasize the negation of the other as their primary goal. They're more interested in promoting their vision of society, which is rooted in what they consider to be good Islamic practice.
In other words, they're far more accommodating of pluralism in various senses.
They are, and I'm not saying that this is a liberal ideology or that it is a socialist ideology or a communist. This is not the point here. But I'll give you a simple example. Like even when it comes to modes of dress, you don't have to be very, let's say, flamboyant in your religiosity to be a Muslim brother. You know, you can have like a small beard, and they usually, in fact, try to keep a modern religious look. Salafi jihadists are obsessed with those kind of symbolic moves. A Muslim Brotherhood women would more often than not wear hijab, but they will cover their hair maybe, but the face will show, the hands will show. But it's more about like actually, subscribing to a certain religiosity in everyday life. Salafi jihadists, the exterior is very important. Enforcement of the literal application of religious law is very important for them. So they are literalists also in the reading of religious texts, which means it's much stricter, but it's also much more subject to accusing others of lack of adherence. Because if you have just one literal interpretation and you believe that you got it right, that Scalia dude who has his own view of the American Constitution, of course, wants to shove it down everybody's throats, and it just happens to be the worst view possible of that document, and everybody has to subscribe to that. It's the same concept.
Where do Shia Islamic politics and movements today, which we see from Iran through Lebanon, Yemen, elsewhere, how do they compare to the two Sunni currents you just described and relate to them politically?
It's a different phenomena, but it has some similarities. I'm glad you asked this question because sometimes people suggest that, let's say, what is considered to be more oppressive practice is seen on the Sunni side, and on the Shia side, you just have resistance against imperialism. That's actually not the case. There is a spectrum in both Sunnism and Shiism. These are large religious currents that have a full spectrum within them. And there are haters here, there are haters there. We saw that in Iraq, there were Shiite death squads. And again, we spoke about this before. There was a sectarian cleansing of large parts of Baghdad that took place. It is a tragedy. And of course, there were attacks on Shiite shrines and so on the part of Sunnis. So you have this entire situation of sectarianization that took place and that produced an inclination towards negating the other, canceling the other, and definitely not accepting, let alone celebrating religious diversity. However, Shia politics tends to be slightly different in some important ways. The traditional big sponsor of Sunni Salafism, but also at certain junctures, actually, Muslim Brotherhood thinking, and we know that it's been promoting both for different reasons, was Saudi Arabia. It had traditionally sponsored these ideologies. Now it has a different stance and it produces its own versions of them. But Historically, that's been the case. In the case of Shia, religious ideology, the main sponsor is Iran. Their position in the network of imperial relations produces major differences between them. Iran has, of course, since the Iranian Revolution, taken a stance against the US presence in the region, starting with Iran itself, but of course elsewhere. They see it as a threat to the independence of Iran, and they see it as something that goes against Islamic religious doctrine. Whereas Saudi Arabia is embroiled in those sort of relations. That creates a different sort of relationship between the sponsoring state and the groups that follow it. That's why Iran can have a so-called axis of resistance around it. Because geopolitically, it has a different project. And of course, here the ideological and the mobilizational and the organizational will intersect with the geopolitical priorities of the state sponsor. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it has had difficulty in maintaining discipline within the groups that it had historically sponsored.
And that really goes back all the way almost to the foundation of the modern Saudi state, in the sense that the monarchy repressed the Ikhwan not so long after the modern state's foundation.
Correct. Traditionally, the monarchy has been instrumentalist in its relationship with the Sunni groups that it supports, including the Ikhwan, which were very central to the formation of the state, as you mentioned, and as we've talked before, but also even in arenas like Lebanon and arenas like Syria and Iraq itself and Yemen. Okay, the Saudi state is not seen as a reliable sponsor. It can shift its lines of sponsorship, but ideologically it has a challenge because it can be seen as being disingenuous in its commitment to the religious precepts that are promoted by the groups it supports, which is exactly what happened with people like Zayman al-Utaybi when he invaded the Haram in Saudi Arabia and caused the serious crisis that we spoke about before. It's exactly what happened with Osama bin Laden, who came again from the Saudi establishment, but got disillusioned. Because on the one hand, you're promoting a line that's saying, we want Islamic State and we want Islamic politics. But then on the other hand, the entire basis of your rule is connected to your relationship with Western powers, in particular the United States. So unlike Iran, Iran doesn't have to deal with this contradiction as the groups it's sponsoring, whereas Saudi Arabia does. The second thing is Iran tends to engage in long-term investments and to place people that are very closely connected to it ideologically, that have been basically educated in its theories. It has a steady approach towards these groups. And that definitely applies especially in the case of Hezbollah, because that is a long-term relationship from the very beginning till now. It has had its ups and downs, especially in the late 90s when there was a debate within Hezbollah on the limits of Hezbollah action, whether it should go all the way to the liberation of Palestine as a whole, or whether it should be contained within the boundaries of liberating the Lebanese South. That was a big debate that was happening in Hezbollah, and the Iranians actually resolved it. They imposed eventually a new leadership under Hassan Nasrallah that stabilized the Iranian line within the party. But for example, now there's a disgruntled old leader of Hezbollah, former Secretary General al-Tufayli, who was engaged in the opposite side of the debate and had challenged the Iranians over this. Yeah. So, they will interfere in internal debates. They'll make their point. They'll even remove, if necessary, the people that they see as obstacles to promoting their point. But at the end of the day, they'll have a long-term relationship. They'll be steady in their support. And as a result, that gives them a geopolitical asset that's there for the long haul.
In 2014, the Arab Spring protests in Yemen descended into civil war as the Houthis took power over large swaths of the country. It was a civil war that was absolutely murderous and that drew in military intervention from the U.S. and also and especially from U.S. allied Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. We've extensively discussed the history of Yemen here on Thawra, and I've dedicated 2 other dig episodes to the country. But briefly, for our purposes here, how should we understand the significance of the civil war in Yemen? What's its significance in particular in terms of the longer history we've discussed, a longer history of Marxist-Leninist revolution and government in South Yemen, and in North Yemen, a civil war between an imamate and nationalists that drew in Nasser's Egypt? And then what's the war's significance geopolitically? Why did the war become of such interest in the way that it did to Yemen's powerful Gulf state neighbors?
So when we look at it historically, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Yemen is one that was marked historically by Saudi expansion into Yemeni territory. So when the third Saudi state emerged, there were several important conquests that they engaged with in areas very close to Yemen, or actually that were historically part of the Yemeni geopolitical arrangement. That includes areas like Najran and so on that are now part of the borderlands between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And the Saudi south, therefore, and definitely the southwest, is very much sensitive to the developments on the Yemeni front. Additionally, of course, there's a very large Yemeni population within Saudi Arabia, and the Yemenis have included both major capitalists in the country, some of the most important commercial families, and have been of Yemeni origin, including the Bin Ladens, by the way, but of course many others, because the Hadrami traders are renowned not just here but across the Asian world. Actually, they're important in Saudi Arabia. They've been important south of India. They were part of the ruling class there. They're important in Indonesia and in Malaysia. They've had prime ministers, and like Al-Attas in Malaysia, for example. They played a big role actually in converting Malaysia and Indonesia through trade to Islam. So these are, long-standing links. In Saudi Arabia, they play a big role. And then you have a working class that's massive, a Yemeni working class also there. Across the Gulf, many of the police forces are of Yemeni origin, like in the Emirates, for example. You find that phenomena. So Yemen is part of the Arabian Peninsula situation. It's a very important part. It is the country with the largest population in relation to the area. In per capita terms, it's also the poorest, and actually even in absolute income terms. So it's seen as a place that could explode at any minute and could destabilize what's around it. Now, historically, of course, the Saudis carried out their biggest regional clash over Yemen. In the old days, their main nemesis, as we know, was Abdel Nasser, and they were worried that he was going to spread republicanism from Yemen and that could have major repercussions for the Saudis. So they fought him really hard there, and we know the story because we told it before here on Thawra, and you've told it before in other episodes of The Dig. But after the Iranian Revolution, the main problem regionally for Saudi Arabia was Iran. And there was, of course, an insurgency that was happening in Yemen against the leader that the Saudis had a decent arrangement with, let's say, Ali Abdullah Saleh. They saw him as a containment force in the country. Of course, he was a total dictator there, but he kept things contained.
And he had once been on the Nasser, the Republican nationalist side of the civil war that Saudi Arabia was on the other side of in North Yemen.
Absolutely. I mean, he shifted alliances a million times in relation to the Saudis. He was a total fox in that way, and which shift even after actually they clashed with the Houthis. He had this, he's tried every side of the political equation and fought against everybody and befriended everybody. And so, but the situation in relation to that character was that he was facing a major insurgency on the part of the Houthis. And the Houthis were increasingly turning to Iran. The north of Yemen, of course, the majority there belong to the Zaydi, sect, it's one of those sects that did not necessarily typically be counted as a Shia one or a Sunni one, but it has elements that are closer to Shiaism.
Similar to Abadi Islam, it has It shares some aspects, but is really more its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, with Ibadism, it's a Kharijite, really. I mean, despite the denials that exist now amongst Ibadi theologians around that, they'll tend to emphasize closeness to Sunnism. But really, at the end of the day, its origin is a Kharijite, which is neither Sunni nor Shia. To explain all of this, Daniel, we'd need a whole episode. But basically, Shias emphasize a very exclusive lineage for who gets to rule the Islamic community, and that has to descend from Ahl al-Bayt, the home of the Prophet. That means that the line of rule has to go through the sons of Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, and Ali, his cousin. But the Sunnis, they say the rule should be concentrated in Quraysh, the broader tribe. And, they've relaxed it over the years. The Ottomans ended up, relaxing some of the rules and so on. But with the Kharijites, from the very beginning, the Khawarij were saying the Imam gets elected and they can be deposed also. And it has to be a process in which the community as a whole is engaged in. And there's no, any Muslim who is sane and who's an adult can be an Imam, basically. So anyways, that's where the Khawarij come from. In the case of the Zaydis in Yemen, they're a very particular interpretation. We're not going to go into it, but what has happened is there's been an increasing Shiification during the time of the revolt that was carried out by Houthis against the central state. And they had a stronghold, which was, of course, Sa'da. It's a region that was ignored by the state and suffered from total marginalization. All of these things have an economic base, as we know. But, eventually, this trend gets backed by Iran, and a relationship develops that of a military nature, economic nature, sponsorship. And that becomes a new asset that is part of the Iranian broader alliance. Now, the Saudis, instead of dealing with that intelligently, they wanted to just crack down on it. They thought they could just come and crack down on the whole space. Now, of course, they did find a schism that was internal to exploit, which is the one between the north and south of Yemen. The south of Yemen, religiously, is a Sunni territory for the most part. The areas that were part of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, Aden and the former British protectorates around it, those areas, which we refer to as Yemen Junubi, South Yemen, they are more sparsely populated than the north, actually. The north has a larger population. But also, they had grievances after the Yemeni unification. Previously, they were under a socialist state that did provide free education, that did provide free healthcare, all sorts of welfare provisions. Of course, it wasn't the richest state out there, but it had a safety net for your ordinary citizen. That was no longer the case after the unification. Furthermore, after the Yemeni Civil War, you had a clear victory on the part of the north and definitely the alliance that was there around Ali Abdullah Saleh. So a lot of the Southerners felt that they didn't have as big a piece of the pie as they ought to have had under unification. In fact, they felt that they were, in a way, provincialized. The universities got worse, the schools became worse, the life was not as good as far as people were concerned. So what we have now is the Saudis and the Emiratis coming in, and they're exploiting, on the one hand, this schism. They, of course, are encouraging it in a way. And by the way, it's not manufactured by them. There are very, very legitimate grievances in the south of Yemen in relation to the north. But these grievances have led many of the leaderships in the south to seek deals with these Gulf governments that ultimately are not necessarily concerned with promoting the welfare of the people of Yemen, but they have their own agendas in relation to containing Iran. Now, obviously, Dan, you're giving me an impossible task by talking about this in a matter of seconds, but I cannot but mention that we must keep an eye on the disastrous human toll that has resulted from this Saudi-Emirati policy in Yemen, which, of course, is ultimately American-backed in indirect ways, because these are states that are floating in the American orbit. They spent enormous amounts of money, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, on a vicious war against a very poor country They engaged in indiscriminate bombardment, tactics that entailed starvation and that resulted in the spread of disease, all these awful diseases that have spread there, like cholera, and even there were some cases are suspected of diseases that we thought were extinct now after the age of immunization. And this is what is awful about this. When it comes to oppressive policies like this, they barely get coverage in places like the United States because they relate to states that are promoting U.S. agendas or are closely allied to the U.S. in the region.
We've discussed already in this epilogue how over time oil revenues and imperialist power had decisively shifted the balance of power away from Egypt, Syria, and Iraq and toward the oil-rich U.S. allied Gulf states. Saudi Arabia has, of course, been a regional power for a very long time. It's just that it's only become more powerful since. But the emergence of the UAE as this fantastically wealthy, belligerent force operating militarily across the region, even deep into North Africa, and normalizing relations with Israel, that is particularly striking. Meanwhile, the working classes of the UAE and also some other Gulf states have become overwhelmingly guest worker working classes, immigrants, often from South Asia, making up a working class of these countries, but having absolutely no citizenship rights. This looks nothing like the trucial states under British domination that existed until the 1970s. These are very different places in such a short amount of time. How would you summarize the trajectory that made the Gulf states, particularly the UAE, into the states that they are today?
I mean, sociologically, we've had, of course, a situation where there's enormous oil wealth that came in a place that had a very small population. And Daniel, the main observation to make here is the way the British drew the boundaries meant, and I'm not saying this was their intention, but this is what ended up happening, that the states with the smallest populations ended up with the biggest oil wealth. So, for example, the crucial states, they were historically part of a geographic unit which could be described as Greater Oman. They were part of bigger Omani political dynamics. But Oman proper, which has a far larger population, and actually does have a local working class. They still utilize, of course, South Asian labor and Arab labor from poorer Arab countries, but there is an actual working class. There you will find a cab driver that is Omani, you will find people working in all sorts of jobs, and they do not own the means of production or anything like that. However, in the case of the UAE, that's an area that had a very small population and then ends up with this big oil wealth, particularly in Abu Dhabi, which became the dominant player in this federation of small emirates that came to be the UAE.
Thanks in part to a colonial coup that we discussed that we're not going to get into here, but we went deep into it.
Yes. Now, under the person that was part of that coup and that got installed as ruler of Abu Dhabi and who became the first president of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed, the policy was actually not regionally aggressive. The policy was focused on keeping the UAE as much as possible outside of trouble and keeping good relations with everyone. The main fear was in relation to the Saudis. They didn't want the full takeover by the Saudis of the whole peninsula, which is always a concern for the smaller states. But also there was a fear in relation to Iran. Iran occupies 3 UAE islands. It claims that it has a strong claim on them. It actually doesn't. To be honest with you, historically, if you dig into it, they are UAE islands, and two of them belong to Sharjah historically. But regardless, the Shah, at the moment of the birth of the UAE, part of the deal that happened during the British withdrawal from the Gulf was they let him take these islands, the British, in exchange for their arrangement going smoothly elsewhere. So there is a problem with Iran, but they wanted to keep relations under control. They didn't want the situation to explode with Iran either. And of course, this meant like a constant balancing act on the part of Sheikh Zayed. He was not keen on Israel at all. He even tried to counterbalance the US at a certain moment. I mean, in 73, there's this curious situation where Sheikh Zayed was seeking to establish a Soviet embassy. But then, of course, the British cracked down on him and suppressed that idea and prevented it from happening. So there was this attempt at keeping some sort of a focus on the local dynamics and on protecting the commercial and economic interests. That's mainly the main focus that was going on at the time, which also reflects the interests of certain important emirates within the UAE, in particular Dubai at the time. Because Dubai is a city-state that depends ultimately on openness to global trade. That is its concept. And it needs the Iranian capital to keep on going. It needs the Saudi capital as well. It needs capital from across the world. It is a center in which that capital gets invested, sometimes laundered, sometimes recycled. It became what it is through being a hub for all of these powers, which means keeping an open policy. Now, there is a shift that takes place after Sheikh Zayed dies, and his sons, one of them is a particularly strong character, which is MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed. For a long time, even before becoming president, his brother, who was ruling before, had fallen ill for many years during the end of his reign, and he kept on, the rule effectively was in the hands of MBZ. He was drawing all the policies. He had shifted from being somebody who was close to Muslim ideas and, was interested in religion and politics somehow, like not in a major way, but you would say something even might be close to Muslim Brotherhood thinking, which in the UAE was important because they had filled the Ministry of Education with Muslim Brotherhood figures. But then, after 9/11, there was a noticeable shift in his thinking. All of the Gulf leaders started freaking out after 9/11. And the UAE in particular, this was a shock because some of its citizens had participated in the attack. It was worried that this is threatening the relationship with the main sponsor and protector of the country, which is the United States. So there was this process of recalibration that was going on, and they decided that they're going to be, first of all, the arch enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood network, and they took on that role with a much more aggressive stance during the period of the Arab Spring, because they felt that this is actually a whole push on the part of the Brotherhood to take over rule in multiple countries. They considered that push was funded by an important power, which is Qatar. That's their reading. I'm not saying that was the Arab Spring can be reduced to that, but this is the way that those people think. And they're like, we're going to crack down on that. So that was one important side of their policy. The other aspect of their policy is driven by the fact that Abu Dhabi, as a result of the financial crisis that had afflicted Dubai, after 2008, of course, the whole world was filled with financial crises, and we know this because we were both involved in Occupy movement in different ways. But later on, Dubai itself undergoes a serious crisis, and it gets bailed out by Abu Dhabi. The price was Abu Dhabi gaining far more political power and control effectively over foreign policy at an unprecedented level. And their vision is much more aggressive. They want to be a regional player. They want to have the lead in the region. The third aspect that relates to this is, in order to be a regional player and to stabilize themselves in a manner that suits them, MBZ was thinking of reformulating his relationship with Saudi Arabia through establishing a very strong alliance that is with the United States that bypasses Saudi Arabia. Previously, all of these smaller states used to accept Saudi leadership, and therefore the main American relationship in this region was with Riyadh, and then the others are junior partners. What MBZ, and this is my interpretation of his whole overall overarching policy, is he wanted a direct relationship with the empire that could actually protect him from the overwhelming influence of Saudi Arabia and could give him some independence from that. So in significant ways, he has taken steps towards that. And this explains his turn to the Israelis. He saw this as a way of ensuring direct access to the main US hallways of power, and basically it creates a certain buffer with the Saudis. This is not particular to him, by the way. It's been done before. Oman did it before the Abraham Accords. You'd remember that Sultan Qaboos, before the Abraham Accords, and one of the worst things he did before he died, was that he invited Netanyahu for a visit to Muscat. And that was done in the context of a struggle with Saudi Arabia over the Duqm port. And here the geopolitics of this, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, Daniel, but I think our listeners might find this curious. Geopolitically, the Saudis, having detected that the Emiratis are kind of developing greater independence in relation to them, have been looking for ways to access Indian Ocean trade without going through Dubai. And they've therefore invested heavily in this idea of establishing a land route from Saudi Arabia to Duqm port in Oman, invested heavily in that infrastructure, which would allow them basically to break away from this dependence on the Dubai network. At some point, MBS, kind of for his own reasons, heightens the pressure on Oman because it had refused to participate in his siege of Qatar policy. So what does Qaboos do? He's feeling that the Duqm project is being undermined by this. And in the meantime, he's worried that Saudi Arabia might do to him what it's doing to Qatar, which is it besieged it, and with the help of the Emiratis, it instituted, and the Bahrainis, it created this boycott situation. So Qaboos goes, invites over Netanyahu. And of course, he gets brownie points with Kushner then, who tells the Saudis to back off, essentially, in relation to Qaboos. So the intersection between the material, the political, economic, and the geostrategic, and the managing empire, but also seeing an acceptance of the settler colonial state as an important aspect of managing empire in this region, as well as managing conflicts with what is a larger power, that of Saudi Arabia in the region, is something that one has to look at when they're considering the overall network. But I'll end with one quick line. Daniel, Americanization in this part of the world always means Israelization. This is very important for our listeners to know. America places demands on all the states in the region that it controls. They have to follow a very particular Israel policy. And the more they approximate themselves to Israel, and the more they ditch the Palestinian cause, the more they're seen to be following imperial diktats correctly, and they get initial brownie points for that.
Why does Qatar play such an unusual role in so many ways in the Gulf?
Well, Qatar is subject to the same geopolitical constraints that everyone else is subject to. It is one of the small states of the Gulf that has to deal with bigger neighbors. And the main Gulf neighbor it has to deal with is Saudi Arabia, of course. Now, historically, the Al Thani are close allies, of course, with the Saudis. Historically, ideologically, they were part of this movement that we described earlier. They had accepted the call of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. To this day, the main mosque in Doha is the Imam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab mosque. That symbolism is huge. That's where, by the way, the funeral of Ismail Haniyeh took place. It was in that mosque. It has great symbolism. Now, the Qataris, though, they've been increasingly dependent on a source of wealth that has given them massive power, which is gas. Or actually mainly dependent on gas, not oil, but and they have massive gas fields. They have long-term interests in relation to maintaining good relations with Iran because of the gas fields and ensuring that everything runs smoothly there. They have an important interest in ensuring that they don't always have to follow Saudi directives. As they grow in wealth, they want a greater say in things, which is something that Saudi Arabia has not historically been very open to. And they've also been very interested in establishing a separate relationship with the Americans. Their style, though, of in creating these relationships is very different than the rest, because what they've done essentially is they've combined hosting the world's and certainly the region's biggest American base, Dade base, which played very important roles in the assault on Iraq and in multiple episodes. They've maintained that while adopting ideologically something that was a hybrid between old Arab nationalist precepts mixed with Muslim Brotherhood precepts. And again, we've talked about this before, but you see it in the sort of broadcasting that is promoted by their main network, Al Jazeera. At the same time, they promoted a big public stance of standing with the Palestinian cause. This is all allowing them to project power that is much bigger than their small size. And in that sense, they're actually similar to the Emiratis, except that the ideologies they're promoting are very, very different. But they're both engaging with the same equation: how to deal with bigger neighbors, how to deal with an imperial state, how to calculate a relationship with the settler colony that's connected to that imperial state. And in the meantime, of course, maintaining complete control at home. So there is no possibility for dissent. What's interesting about the Emirates is it used to be quite an open space, and even Qatar, you could talk as much as you wanted within certain parameters. Since MBZ, though, the parameters have been increasingly shrinking. And there are many Emirati intellectuals, for example, that were preemptively silenced when the deal was signed with Israel. They were told, you're not allowed to say anything. And there are others that have been abducted, put in jails, have disappeared for a long time. This kind of engagement in state violence on a big scale was unknown to places like the Emirates before. So there is a shift happening. There's increasing aggression abroad and increasing repression at home, and their combination has been pretty lethal.
And again, it coincides with Americanization, which always means Israelization. That was the second of our three-part epilogue to Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics, with Abdelrazak Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that if the emancipation of the working classes requires their fraternal concurrence, how are they to fulfill that great mission? With a foreign policy in pursuit of criminal designs, playing upon national prejudices, and squandering in piratical wars the people's blood and treasure. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And please, find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please also rate and review us kindly. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling other people to check out this pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.